on across our great nation.
And from 3 till 6, watch out for GB News Live with me, Patrick Christys. I'm not here to mess around. With all the biggest topics and guests, you will always be up to date. GB Newsday and GB News Live from 12 p.m.
Only on GB News.
The People's Channel, Britain's news channel.
Hello there, it's Eamon Holmes here from Breakfast on GB News. We're not just on your television and your screens, you know.
We're on DAB plus digital radio, so you can listen to your favourite shows on the move.
If you've not yet listened to GB News Radio, it's very simple. We're on your radio player and tune-in apps, on your smart speaker, phone or tablet, or online at gbnews.uk.
Take us with you wherever you go. GB News Radio.
You never have to miss a moment of the People's Channel.
Join my show Farage, 7 p.m. till 8 p.m. Monday through Thursday, and there you will get opinion, analysis, debate, and I'll cover stories that nobody else dares to touch.
You've been cancelled. Join the club.
Oh my goodness me! And then for the last 15 minutes, talking pints. We're over a drink. We have a civilised conversation with someone. We very often disagree, but we do it in a grown-up way. Come and join me on Farage.
Hello, I'm Simon Evans. Join me on GB News for Headliners at 11 p.m, where I'll be joined by two of the country's top comedians as we take a look at tomorrow's newspapers tonight. If it's a big story, we'll be covering it, I guarantee, but we'll also have some fun along the way. That's GB News Headliners at 11 p.m. We won't put you to sleep, unlike some of the other paper review shows out there. So join us, 11 p.m, 7 nights a week.
Hello and a very warm welcome to GB Newsday with me, Mark Longhurst.
And me, Gloria De Piero.
The Bank of England has made another urgent intervention in the financial markets. It's again warning of a risk to the UK's financial stability.
It comes as the Institute for Fiscal Studies has warned that the government needs to find another £62 billion in savings to balance the country's books.
Britain's doctors are also warning that the health of Britain's population is declining, and as inequalities are widening, our life expectancy is flatlining.
And as the politicians finally get back to work today, it's the battle of the Chancellor and his opposite number over his Halloween budget. Will it be trick or treat in the Commons this afternoon?
And today, marking the start of the Scottish Government's efforts in the Supreme Court, no less, to win a second independence referendum. We'll have the very latest view on that.
And as ever, we want to hear from you at home, so please get in touch with us on all of today's big stories at gbviews@gbnews.uk. We'll read some of your emails out throughout the show. Before all of that, let's get the latest news headlines with Rosie.
Good afternoon, it's just 2 minutes past 12. I'm Rosie Wright, keeping you up to date today on GB News. The Bank of England have bought more government debt, having warned again there's risk to the UK's financial stability. Initially forced to act to counter turmoil in the markets after the Chancellor's mini-budget, the bank's now expanding its bond buying in an effort to, they say, restore orderly market conditions. The bank warned that a sell-off of government bonds posed a material risk, and they say they've acted to prevent dysfunction in the debt market. The Chancellor will have to find spending cuts of more than £60 billion if he wants to convince investors that he can get the public finances back under control. Well, that's the analysis of a leading economic think tank, the Institute for Fiscal Studies. Kwasi Kwarteng will appear in the Commons this afternoon and face questions from MPs about his plans. The Labour Party are calling for Liz Truss and Kwasi Kwarteng to reverse more of their decisions made on the mini-budget. The Shadow Chief Secretary to the Treasury, Pat McFadden, told us the government's strategy is wrong.
What the government's going to do now is announce a whole series of public spending cuts in this Halloween fiscal event at the end of the month. And, you know, this doesn't make sense to make one set of mistakes and then compound it by making the public pay for ministers' mistakes through cuts in public services. It'd be far better to pause this whole thing and revisit the mistakes that caused the market chaos in the first place.
Some other news for you now. The Prime Minister will urge G7 leaders to remain steadfast in support of Ukraine during crisis talks this afternoon. Well, Liz Truss and her Ukrainian counterpart will join the virtual meeting of world leaders. It's after Russia launched its most significant attack on Ukraine in months. Missile strikes hit Kyiv and other cities, killing at least 19 people and injuring more than 100. Further air raid sirens have been heard this morning in the capital amid warnings of further Russian missile attacks. The Ukrainian MP Alexei Goncharo told GB News President Putin's actions are an act of war.
All these wars against civilian areas, this was an act of terror. So Putin tries to threaten Ukrainians, but this will not happen. We are not afraid of Putin. We showed it to the whole world. And from this point of view, this was absolutely useless attack for Putin, but also it was a huge criminal crime, war crime from Russia.
The head of Britain's intelligence agency, GCHQ, says Ukraine is successfully turning the tide against Russian forces despite recent attacks. In a speech later today, Sir Jeremy Fleming will say Russian gains are being reversed in a staggering cost to the Kremlin. Meanwhile, the UK's ambassador to the UN, Dame Barbara Woodward, said last night she repeated her calls for Russia to end the war.
Putin is trying to take Ukraine's land, its resources, its identity. In doing so, he is overturning the most sacred principle in the international system, that borders cannot be drawn by force.
The Scottish Government's told the Supreme Court it's in the public interest to resolve the issue of whether Holyrood can hold a second referendum on independence. Well, currently, Scotland's top law officer is putting forward the case for a second independence referendum. We can see it taking place live now. They want to do that, of course, without the support of Westminster. Well, the First Minister, Nicola Sturgeon, says she wants to be able to hold an indisputably lawful vote. 2 days have been set aside for the hearing. The UK government are expected to respond tomorrow. Unemployment in the UK has dropped to its lowest rate in over 50 years. Figures from the Office for National Statistics said the rate fell to 3.5% over the 3 months to August. However, wages are failing to keep up with the rising cost of living. There's also been a record rise in the number of people off work or not looking for work because of long-term sickness. The first of the funerals for the victims of the service station explosion in County Donegal in Ireland are taking place today. Candlelit vigils have been held to remember the victims of a suspected gas explosion which killed 10 people on Friday. Police believe the blast was an accident and they're investigating the cause. Heathrow has regained its status as Europe's busiest airport despite struggling with staff shortages and imposing a daily passenger cap over the summer. The airport claims it had a higher volume of travellers between July and September of this year than any of Europe's other busy terminals, like those in Paris and Amsterdam. However, demand at Heathrow last month was still 15% lower than before the pandemic. You're now up to date on GB News. I'll bring you more as it develops. Now, let's head to Newsday.
Rosie, thanks very much indeed. So, a leading group of analysts and economists issuing a warning that the UK economy is at serious risk. The Institute of Fiscal Studies saying that the Chancellor must now find around £62 billion to get the UK's finances back under control.
It says he can't balance the books. If he can't balance the books, it could mean a financial crisis having an impact on interest rates, public spending and pensions. The warning comes as the Bank of England makes another urgent intervention in the markets because of what they describe as a material risk to the UK's financial stability.
Let's turn to our economics and business editor, Liam Halligan, with On the Money. Here we go again. Basically, they're saying or talking about dysfunction in the markets, which is gilt, which is all very, very technical. But basically, they had announced they were going to be spending this money. They've had to intervene once again.
They have. The Bank of England announced last week it would spend up to £65 billion in the gilts market. What does that mean? It means buying up government debt. in order to make that debt more attractive to all investors, in order to keep the borrowing costs of those investors required down, which keeps all other borrowing costs down across the economy. Now the Bank of England has this morning said it's spent about 5 billion out of that 65 billion. It's now saying it's going to spend up to about 10 billion of that 65 billion, and borrowing costs have actually come down a little bit this morning. But there's lots of complexity here, as you say, Mark. So I've prepared some graphics that I think
excellent
GB News viewers,
explain all to us,
may find useful, and hopefully listeners as well on GB News Radio. I'll certainly try. So I wanted to say that it was on the 22nd of September, if we can have the first graphic, that the Bank of England raised that base rate of interest to 2.25%. That was from 1.75%. And that was fully expected. In fact, a lot of people expected them to raise it to 2.5%. So that was on the 22nd of September. And that was the day before, at that point, if we can have the next graphic, the money market's interest rate was 3.49%. That's the gilts market you talk about. That actually sets the benchmark for all other mortgage rates and personal loans rates. So that's the kind of main commercial interest rate in the UK, the rate at which the government borrows money. And the government can borrow money more cheaply than anyone else. So any new mortgage would obviously be more expensive than that. What happened then on the 23rd of September, the next day, that's when you had the mini budget. And you see the picture there of the Chancellor, Kwasi Kwarteng. And that has led to concerns about fiscal responsibility. That's why the money markets rate, it's up. It was 3.49 before the mini budget. Now it's 4.44. That's a big increase. And that is why mortgage rates are going up. But this isn't a short-term thing. What I'm showing now for listeners on radio is a graph of the average mortgage rate each month across 2022. And in January, it was about 3.5%. In September, a long time before the mini budget, it was already up at 4.5%. Now, because of the mini budget and other long-term interest rate trends, it's up towards 6%. This is the average mortgage cost of all sort of lengths of loan, of all different types of loan. I've put them all together in a sort of composite measure to keep it simple. So yes, mortgage rates are now higher than they were, a lot higher than they were in January when they were just above 3%. Now they're averaging 6%. But look at the trend. It's a gradual, long-term trend. This is not all about the politics. This is not all about mistakes that ministers are making, though they have made big mistakes in the presentation and the timing of their announcements. But the actual fiscal stance is not a million miles away from where it was.
And one of the things that they have faced criticism for is not publishing those independent forecasts. They will do that on the 31st of October. It'll be the first time you can all see the sums, the nation's books.
That's right.
How scary or otherwise, how much of a shock or otherwise will we discover when we open those books up?
Well, we generally have two big assessments by the OBR, as you say rightly, Gloria, the Office of Budget Responsibility, the independent fiscal watchdog. It's kind of linked to government, but it's separate from the Treasury and the Chancellor. And rightly so. George Osborne brought that OBR in, and I think everybody agrees it's a good idea. We had one of those assessments back in March when Rishi Sunak gave his spring statement, seems a long time ago. And the Chancellor would argue we should wait as long as we can to have the next one because so much is happening. We've got that energy price cap that could cost hundreds of billions. Mark, it could cost tens of billions. It could cost nothing. It depends on where the wholesale price of gas is. But that quite strong argument that we should wait until we have more information is now being trumped by a much more powerful argument from the markets. We need to know now. We need to know now because we're concerned. And he has brought the date of that fiscal statement forward from the 23rd of November to the... he said to me in an interview...
last week.
Labour,
naughty boy.
Tory conference, it'll be the 21st of November. Now it's Halloween, the 31st of October. The question on my mind, will it be earlier still?
Let's throw some more initials into that mix. You have OBI, the IFS, Institute of Fiscal Studies, very highly regarded. Yeah, but, you know, they are a watchdog and they keep an eye on these things. They're now saying that actually, because of the way the economy might be going, the Chancellor, Kwasi Kwarteng, may have to find another £62 billion from somewhere.
Yeah, I mean, I've got a lot of respect for the IFS. They're not a part of government. They do get some state money through grant-making bodies and so on. But they are independent and they're full of very, very smart economists for whom I have a lot of respect. But what the IFS tend to do, they tend to look at individual tax changes, spending changes, and how they affect other tax and spending. They very much look, the names on the tin, they are Fiscal, the Institute for Fiscal Studies, tax and spend, the public finances. That's what Fiscal means. What the IFS don't really do, with all respect to them, is they don't really look at the whole macroeconomy. They wouldn't really look at what the growth number's going to be, the growth number that drives all those other numbers. They wouldn't really look at the, you know, the trade position, currencies and things like that. They're not big picture macroeconomists. So if you look at it in a kind of, you know, limited way, then yes, the government does need to find this money. And there's a headline number, we're going to have to cut public spending by a huge amount, and that's obviously very scary. That's if you try and make all the judgment, all the adjustment happen just on spending cuts. You can adjust in different ways. I mean, Pat McFadden there, Shadow Chief Secretary of Treasury, very bright guy. He knows his way around the public finances. He acknowledged there in his interview it could be not just about spending cuts, it could be about tax rises as well, or reversing those.
Yes,
and that's why he's saying maybe they should rip up the whole thing. So, and also the IFS, I would say, they don't consider in their numbers, to the extent that I've seen, and I apologise to them if this is in the fine print that I haven't quite got to yet, they don't consider that the energy price cap may actually be a lot less
good point.
than we actually, you know, a lot of people are saying it is.
Yeah, because
but we're going to have to find the headline. We can argue about the figures, but we're going to have to either cut public spending or raise taxes in some way. We're going to have to do something. It's 62 billion you may be querying, but...
No, it depends on growth, though. If you get the growth...
Yeah, but that's not... But we're not going to get that immediately, is there?
No, but if you get more growth, then the fiscal outlook suddenly looks really good.
Yeah,
I mean, but Gloria, we can definitely agree. The headline for me would be, they're sailing pretty close to the wind.
Yeah. Anyway, more drama perhaps to come because we've got the Chancellor and his opposite number, Rachel Reeves, in the Commons a little later. More Halloween psychodrama. Who knows? We shall see. We'll have that for you a bit later. But let's tell you now about Britain's highest court determining the future of a second referendum for Scottish independence.
This is the scene now from inside the Supreme Court in central London, where lawyers for both sides are battling it out in front of judges.
I remember that First Minister Nicola Sturgeon closing the SNP's conference up in Aberdeen yesterday, asserting it was the will of the country, Scotland that is, that there should be a second vote.
So, as you can see, the Supreme Court is already underway determining whether the Scottish Government can hold that referendum without permission from Westminster and that it be lawful. Our political editor, Darren McCaffrey, can give you all the details.
In Scotland, the battle for the future of Britain has not gone away. After success in last year's Holyrood elections, the SNP argued they're determined not to give up on the hope of independence.
Whether it's Tory or Labour, Labour or Tory, it's not us who gets to decide. Our votes don't determine who gets to occupy number 10. For Scotland, the problem is not just which party is in power at Westminster. The problem is Westminster.
But ultimately, the decision for a second referendum is currently not theirs to take. That's why the battle is moving to London and to here, the UK's Supreme Court, who will decide if MPs at Westminster or MSPs in Edinburgh should have the final say on another vote.
But what if the decision doesn't go their way? Well, that leaves Nicola Sturgeon and the SNP with two big problems. First of all, what do they do next, particularly when the Prime Minister, Liz Truss, has made it clear that she thinks there shouldn't be another vote anytime soon? And second of all, while the polls are pretty divided on independence, evenly split, only a third of Scots think that now is the right time for another referendum.
a lot of people expect the Supreme Court to rule against that. And if that's the case, she said that she'll try to turn the next general election into a de facto referendum. Whether she can actually do that, I mean, who can, after all, decide what is the issues of an election campaign? So there's doubts over whether it actually will be a de facto referendum. But I think what Nicola Sturgeon is maybe trying to do on that as well is to retain relevance, to try to ensure that her supporters don't vote for Labour instead. So by raising the issue of independence, she might be able to hold on to those pro-independence votes.
But for most SNP activists, Nicola Sturgeon must not relent.
We will use the Westminster election, the next Westminster election. If the Supreme Court says no, that will be used as a plebiscite referendum. We have that right under international law.
Are you frustrated, though?
With the UK government, absolutely. As she said at the weekend, if they are so confident, why not just let it go ahead?
What should she do next? What do you want to see her do next?
Well, she said she's going to use it for the next general election.
Do you think that's going to work, though?
I'm not sure. I'm not really sure. But I hope so. But let's hope. Let's wait and see what the Supreme Court says. Then we'll make a judgment, I think.
For the moment, focus will now be on the Supreme Court's hearing. With a judgment due to take months, this drawn-out battle is not likely to conclude anytime soon, to the frustration of nearly everyone on every side of the debate. Darren McCaffrey, GB News, Aberdeen.
Our national reporter Paul Hawkins is at the Supreme Court where that hearing is taking place, and he joins us now. Paul, you've been listening to the arguments that have been made. Just tell us about them.
Yeah, so Gloria, today is all about the Scottish Government setting out its case. Tomorrow we'll hear from the UK Government. Today it's the Scottish Government. Their top legal officer, Dorothy Bain-Cusey, has been speaking quite softly, it should be said, inside courtroom number 1 there. So a lot of the media and everyone there straining to hear what she's saying. But effectively, she's been answering 2 things. Firstly, does she have the permission to ask the judges to rule on whether the Scottish Government can introduce legislation for a referendum without the say-so of Westminster? Now, she set out the terms of the Scotland Act from 1998, which talks about devolution and how that's going to work. There are a list of questions within the Scotland Act which says that the top legal officer in the Scottish Government can ask the Supreme Court of the UK to rule on. None of those questions mention a referendum. However, she has submitted to the court that one of the questions that it does say is the law does include the phrase that she can ask any other question arising by virtue about reserved matters, and she's saying that this question of whether legislation can be introduced for a referendum does fall into that any other question. So she's setting out that case simply that the judges need to try and answer the question. She's also mentioned documents in court such as Scotland's right to choose, that the Scottish Government's case that Brexit has changed the argument for a referendum, also citing the SNP's 2021 manifesto and quoting various debates from Parliament as well, in arguing that there is a political case for clearing up that question. Or as she calls it, quoting Lord Mackay of Drumadoon, a festering issue of whether the Scottish Government can introduce legislation for a referendum without Westminster's say-so. So she's asking the judges effectively this morning to say, look, you need to answer this question one way or another. I agree there is ambiguity. It does need to be answered. And she's also been quoting the 2014 referendum and the 2016 Brexit referendum, saying that those two were both consultative referendums, advisory referendums, that there is no legal basis for them, and that even if we were to have one, we would still have to enact legislation to try and part Scotland from the rest of the United Kingdom. So she's saying it's advisory, and she's saying that the court does need to answer this question one way or another to clear up this ambiguity. She's still setting out her submission. There'll be a lunch break due shortly, and then she'll continue to make her submissions this afternoon.
OK, well, Paul, no wonder they're taking 2 days to do this. But let's just be clear. Whatever they decide, whatever they rule, is that it? That there are no further discussions or debates or any kind of political referendums to come?
Yeah, that's the thing. See, that's the interesting thing. Legally, there can be no referendum. Nicola Sturgeon has always been very adamant that if she were to hold another referendum, in her words, it would have to be a gold standard referendum, exactly like the 2014 one, where Westminster gave power to the Scottish Government to carry out that referendum. Now, if the court here say, no, you can't go ahead, and they will issue their judgment in weeks, if not months, so we won't hear anything this week. It'll be sometime before the judges make their verdict public. But if they were to say, no, the Scottish Government doesn't have the power to introduce legislation for a referendum, that power lies with Westminster, then it's up to Westminster to say so. And so we're kind of back to square one, really. Nicola Sturgeon then saying, OK, well, I'm going to make the next general election a one-issue vote, basically. Yes, there'll be discussion about public services and all that kind of stuff, but effectively the next general election will be a de facto referendum on independence. That said, the outcome of that general election, of course, would not mean that she could legally carry out a referendum, but it would give more of a political indication of the way public opinion is in Scotland at the time. But that said, that could be 2 years away.
Paul, thanks very much indeed, updating us, as you say, the lawyers calling it a festering issue. Back to you throughout the afternoon as we hear more on that case. Thanks very much indeed.
Coming up, Liz Truss continues her charm offensive with her Conservative MPs. The Chancellor gears up to face the Shadow Chancellor in the House of Commons in about 2 hours' time. And Britain's health is in decline.
Yeah, just to cheer you up. We're speaking to Daisy Cooper from the Liberal Democrats on how to combat that. Before that, let's take a look at the weather for you.
Hello again, I'm Aidan McGivern from the Met Office. It was a chilly start for many in the south with a touch of frost in places. And it's a fine day for most, especially in the south where we keep the sunshine. But in the north, for Scotland and Northern Ireland, it's going to turn progressively more cloudy, more breezy, and there will be some rain later on ahead of these weather fronts that are moving in from the Atlantic. But high pressure across England and Wales brings mostly a fine day. The best of the sunny spells will be across East Anglia, the South Midlands, southern counties of England and South Wales. Further north, cloudier skies, 1 or 2 light showers for Cumbria into the Pennines. But more persistent rain will affect western Scotland along with a freshening breeze. And here, 12 or 13 Celsius will be the high in the afternoon, but further south, 15 or 16 Celsius possible where we get the sunny spells. But it's in the south and more especially the southeast where we keep the clear skies overnight. It will be once again a chilly night. But elsewhere, for much of the UK, thickening clouds and outbreaks of rain spilling into western Scotland, western parts of England, Wales and Northern Ireland. Some heavy bursts, mainly over western hills, but that will keep it mild. Temperatures staying in the double figures. A breezy night to come as well, with the strongest winds around the Western Isles. And then that rain pushes through the rest of Scotland into northern England, parts of Wales, and by lunchtime it's reaching Cornwall as well. But it does turn more showery by this stage. It clears Scotland and Northern Ireland, where sunny spells replaces the rain, and highs of 13 or 14 Celsius. And it stays bright in East Anglia in the southeast. After a chilly start here, 17 degrees is likely by the end of the day. Now, the front becomes slow-moving as it crosses central parts of the UK. Some heavy showers in places, particularly northern England, North Midlands, and then later on into much of Wales and the southwest. That front disappears, but more unsettled weather is on the way for Thursday and Friday. It's also going to turn much more windy.
Weekday afternoons on GB News, we've got the whole of the UK covered. From 12 to 3, it's GB Newsday with me, Mark Longhurst.
And me, Gloria De Piero. You'll get the very latest on everything that's been going on across our great nation.
And from 3 till 6, watch out for GB News Live with me, Patrick Christie. I'm not here to mess around with all the biggest topics and guests. You will always be up to date. GB Newsday and GB News Live from 12 p.m.
Only on GB News.
The People's Channel, Britain's news channel.
Hello there, it's Eamon Holmes here from Breakfast on GB News. We're not just on your television and your screens, you know.
We're on DAB plus digital radio, so you can listen to your favourite shows on the move.
If you've not yet listened to GB News Radio, it's very simple. We're on your radio player and TuneIn apps, on your smart speaker, phone or tablet, or online at gbnews.uk.
Take us with you wherever you go. GB News Radio.
You never have to miss a moment of the People's Channel.
Join my show Farage, 7 p.m. till 8 p.m. Monday through Thursday, and there you will get opinion, analysis, debate, and I'll cover stories that nobody else dares to touch.
You've been cancelled. Join the club.
Oh my goodness me. And then for the last 15 minutes, talking pints. We're over a drink. We have a civilised conversation with someone. We very often disagree, but we do it in a grown-up way. Come and join me on Farage.
Hello, I'm Simon Evans. Join me on GB News for Headliners at 11 p.m, where I'll be joined by two of the country's top comedians as we take a look at tomorrow's newspapers tonight. If it's a big story, we'll be covering it, I guarantee, but we'll also have some fun along the way. That's GB News Headliners at 11 p.m. We won't put you to sleep, unlike some of the other paper review shows out there. So join us, 11 p.m, 7 nights a week.
Just in case you're feeling a bit sick of all the news, Britain's doctors warning the health of the UK population declining, health inequalities widening as well.
In a report published today, the British Medical Association has found a lower life expectancy as a result of the decline in the population's health.
Well, in detail, since 2014, it said life expectancy flatlined around 79.2 years for men, 82.9 years for women.
Pleased to be joined now by Daisy Cooper, the Liberal Democrat MP and health author. Hi, Daisy. Good to see you. We've just come through a terrible, terrible pandemic. Could that be to blame for widening health inequalities and flatlining life expectancy?
Well, the pandemic clearly has set our health and care services back, but there's no doubt that they were being run into the ground for years and years and years by the Conservative government well before the pandemic arrived. The fact is that everyone knows that it's hard to get an appointment with a GP, it's hard to get, or near impossible to get an appointment with a dentist. When people call ambulances, they often don't arrive for hours. And it's hugely frustrating that this is now being seen in terms of the statistics that people are so familiar with, which is now we are no longer becoming a healthier country, we are becoming a more ill country. And if we want to increase growth, if we want to be a productive economy, then we absolutely have to invest in our health and social care services.
Specific terms, Daisy, that they've identified. I mean, we know that cancer is largely a disease of old age, and there's been a great discussion, of course, about the lack of cancer screening because of the pandemic.
Well, one of the things that MPs have been calling on the government to do is to roll out more diagnostic capability and to have more diagnostic hubs, including those that can actually travel around the country. That would be a really important investment that the government could make to actually accelerate diagnostic tests so we can actually tackle that cancer backlog in particular. You're right to highlight the issue related to cancer, but of course this is right across the board. There are backlogs for all sorts of different medical conditions, and quite frankly we have a workforce at the moment that is understaffed because there are so many vacancies. They are overstretched, they are exhausted from the pandemic, and it's unbelievable that the Conservative government actually spent 8 months fighting a cross-party coalition in Parliament when we were calling for the government to have a legal obligation to publish workforce projections every single year so we knew how many staff we actually needed. The government spent months and months and months fighting that needlessly. Had they accepted it, we could have started planning for the future. We could have said to our health and social care workforce, the cavalry is coming. But the government has refused to do that. So clearly the backlog is a major issue, but the government isn't taking the quick wins that many organisations and patient groups are calling for.
Alarming health story to do with the workplace shortages that you identified. Today, figures revealing there are 165,000 vacancies in the adult social care sector. They need a pay rise, surely?
You're absolutely right. Yes, they do need a pay rise, and I think across the board, Liberal Democrats would like to see workers getting a pay rise as close to inflation as is possible. There's a number of particular problems facing the social care sector. The first is that it's not really promoted as a career. The second is that it's not competitive. We have social care workers leaving social care and going into the NHS because similar roles are more competitive and pay more even in the NHS. We have lots of social care workers leaving health and social care altogether and going to work in hospitality because they can get better pay there. And if we as a country value social care, which we should, because care is so important to so many people, it enables them to lead their lives. If we really care about social care, we do need to see a pay rise for social care workers. We need to see professional development. We need to see career progression, and we see better employment practices that help keep those people who are in social care staying in the profession for the long term. We need to have a long-term plan for social care, and at the moment the government just keeps offering quick fix plasters that are not fixing the underlying problems.
Daisy Cooper, Liberal Democrat MP and Health spokesperson, thanks for your time today.
Now, let's tell you that after the break, a former Labour shadow minister from the Corbyn wing of the party, remember him? Deselected from standing to keep hold of his London seat. Sir Keir Starmer's allies appear to be celebrating. We'll have the latest from Tom Harwood.
And can you afford to die? It's more expensive than you think. Our reporter Jeff Moody has been exploring the rising costs of funeral. First, it's your news update.
Good afternoon, it's 12:33. I'm Rosie Wright, keeping you up to date on GB News. The Bank of England have brought more government debt, having warned again there is a risk to the UK's financial stability. Initially forced to act to counter turmoil in the markets after the Chancellor's mini-budget, the bank is now expanding its bond buying in an effort to restore orderly market conditions. The bank warned that a sell-off of government bonds posed material risk and say they've acted to prevent dysfunction in the debt market. The Chancellor will have to find spending cuts of more than £60 billion if he wants to convince investors he can get the public finances back under control. That's the analysis of a leading economic think tank, the Institute for Fiscal Studies. Well, Kwasi Kwarteng's going to appear in the Commons this afternoon to face questions from MPs about his plans. The Prime Minister Liz Truss will urge G7 leaders to remain steadfast in support of Ukraine during crisis talks this afternoon. It's after Russia launched its most significant attack on Ukraine in months. Missile strikes hit Kyiv and other cities, killing at least 19 people and injuring more than 100. More air raid sirens have been heard this morning in the capital, amid warnings of further Russian missile attacks. The head of Britain's intelligence agency, GCHQ, says Ukraine is successfully turning the tide against Russian forces, despite recent attacks. In a speech later today, Sir Jeremy Fleming will say Russian gains are being reversed in a staggering cost to the Kremlin. The Scottish Government's told the Supreme Court it's in the public interest to resolve the issue of whether Holyrood can hold a second referendum on independence. Well, Scotland's top law officer is currently putting forward the case for a second independence referendum. We can see that taking place live now. They want to do that, of course, without the support of Westminster. Well, the First Minister, Nicola Sturgeon, says she wants to be able to hold an indisputably lawful vote next year. 2 days have been set aside for the hearing that's ongoing. The UK government are expected to respond tomorrow. Just Stop Oil protesters have blocked some emergency vehicles as part of their demonstration in London this morning. A fire engine and an ambulance on blue lights were initially unable to get through until the demonstrators paused to let them pass. Campaigning for the UK government to stop using and developing fossil fuels, the group have caused disruption to major thoroughfares in central London over the last 11 days. We're on your TV, online and DAB+ radio. It's GB News.
Weekday afternoons on GB News, we've got the whole of the UK covered. From 12 to 3, it's GB Newsday with me, Mark Longhurst.
And me, Gloria De Piero. You'll get the very latest on everything that's been going on across our great nation.
And from 3 till 6, watch out for GB News Live with me, Patrick Christie. I'm not here to mess around with all the biggest topics and guests. You will always be up to date. GB Newsday and GB News Live from 12 p.m.
Only on GB News.
The People's Channel, Britain's news channel.
Hello there, it's Eamon Holmes here from Breakfast on GB News. We're not just on your television and your screens, you know.
We're on DAB plus digital radio, so you can listen to your favourite shows on the move.
If you've not yet listened to GB News Radio, it's very simple. We're on your radio player and TuneIn apps, on your smart speaker, phone or tablet, or online at gbnews.uk.
Take us with you wherever you go. GB News Radio.
You never have to miss a moment of the People's Channel.
Join my show Farage, 7 p.m. till 8 p.m. Monday through Thursday. And there you will get opinion, analysis, debate, and I'll cover stories that nobody else dares to touch.
You've been cancelled. Join the club.
Oh my goodness me. And then for the last 15 minutes, talking pints. We're over a drink. We have a civilised conversation with someone. We very often disagree, but we do it in a grown-up way. Come and join me on Farage.
Hello, I'm Simon Evans. Join me on GB News for Headliners at 11 p.m, where I'll be joined by two of the country's top comedians as we take a look at tomorrow's newspapers tonight. If it's a big story, we'll be covering it, I guarantee, but we'll also have some fun along the way. That's GB News Headliners at 11 p.m. We won't put you to sleep, unlike some of the other paper review shows out there. So join us, 11 p.m, 7 nights a week.
Welcome back to GB Newsday. Now, the cost of living crisis hitting many people, of course, trying to reduce their spending and cut back on life's luxuries.
But new figures reveal the rising cost of funerals is forcing many to borrow money to give their loved ones a decent send-off. And in many cases, people are having to abandon the idea of a funeral altogether.
Well, our South West of England reporter Jeff Moody has been to meet a funeral director concerned at this cost of dying crisis.
The polished hearses, the fresh flowers, the coffin. The way we say goodbye doesn't come cheap, and when you throw in rising energy and fuel prices, the cost of dying is the highest it's ever been. Michael Peace is part of a family firm of undertakers in Hampshire that has been providing services to the community for over 60 years.
On our premises here, we've got a number of refrigeration units that we have to run continuously to look after deceased in the appropriate and the best manner, and so those costs are going up, and of course we have to sometimes pass those things on to the client.
The average price of a funeral has now tipped £4,000, but in a new report from Sun Life, 1 in 5 say they are shocked at how expensive a funeral is. A third of people haven't saved enough for their own funeral, and many are now taking out loans or opting for a no-frills cremation, without fuss, without ceremony, without mourners.
And for example, the crematorium here locally may do what's called a direct cremation service, so that keeps the cost to a minimum as well. I think that they're an extremely good option for people who are concerned about what they're spending on funerals, but are able to do it in a dignified and professional way.
But there is a concern. Funerals are part of the whole grieving process, from the cars to the flowers to the coffin. And the worry is, if you dispense with too much of that, you're not grieving properly and you're storing up trouble for the future.
But obviously one of the challenges, and I think we saw this quite clearly with the Queen's funeral recently, is there is a desire on the part of lots of people to say farewell or pay their respects in person. And actually that can be quite helpful for the grieving process. So it's very definitely not a choice for everyone.
So says the National Association of Funeral Directors. But there's help at hand. The funeral expenses payment is a one-off means-tested payment designed to support people on benefits. In recent years, protest group Fair Funerals has been urging the government to step in and help further, ensuring everyone has the chance of a dignified farewell.
Don't wait until you're grieving to start thinking and talking to your family about funeral costs, because the fact is that when we are grieving, we're not able to act very often as savvy consumers. So unfortunately, we can end up spending more than we can afford on funerals.
Debt and rising costs are a huge part of our lives at the moment. The hope is those debts don't become a part of our deaths too. Jeff Moody, GB News.
Worrying stuff there from Jeff Moody. Now, Liz Truss, the Prime Minister, will be holding a series of meetings with Conservative MPs this week as Parliament returns. It returns today, and she'll be making efforts to quell any discontent over her fledgling premiership.
Yes, of course, much unease over the government's direction. Clear to see, of course, at that party conference in Birmingham last week.
However, Cabinet Ministers have been calling on MPs to unite behind the Prime Minister in an attempt to repair relations. She's now appointed Greg Hands, who is a Rishi Sunak supporter, into a government position that replaces a vacancy made by Conor Byrne's suspension.
But it's this afternoon, Kwasi Kwarteng facing a difficult time at Treasury questions. Major questions, of course, still hanging over that mini-budget, and the Bank of England indicating it's had to intervene in the financial markets once more.
Well, let's now get the latest from GB News' political correspondent, Tom Harwood, who is in Westminster for us. He has come live from a briefing from the Prime Minister's official spokesman. I say men because you told me it was a man yesterday, Tom. This is the event where the Prime Minister's spokesman briefs journalists about the things that you want to tell the public. So what do they want what information do they want you to disseminate from their briefing?
Well, you know, it's always a bit of a tug of war in these briefings. The government has their lines that they want to impart, but the journalists, the lobby, have their questions they want to ask and the information they want to tease out of the government. We started today by discussing this cabinet briefing, this cabinet meeting, or I should say probably two cabinet meetings, because before the official cabinet sat political cabinet earlier this morning. And why is that important? Well, political cabinet does not have to impart the information that was discussed, whereas official cabinet does require a readout to determine what was discussed. It's government business rather than political business. That's the sort of differentiation between those two. And we got this readout from the official cabinet meeting, talking a lot about this growth plan, talking a bit about the war in Ukraine as well. However, asking about the situation in the gilt markets, the intervention of the Bank of England, we got the response that the government did not discuss that in official cabinet, although it may well have been discussed in political cabinet. Another bone of contention here, of course, is that this is the second cabinet meeting, the second official cabinet meeting that the Prime Minister has held since becoming Prime Minister, and also the second time when her official spokesman was not allowed to attend the meeting. We understand that no special advisors were allowed to attend that meeting as well. Now, that's a break from the way that these meetings were conducted under Boris Johnson, when civil servants and special advisors sat in on those meetings as well at the back of the room, listening in, taking notes. Under Liz Truss, these are much more closed meetings, without civil servants or special advisors, without the Prime Minister's official spokesman present. And why is that important? Well, for the government, it's so that they can keep a lid on leaks, so that these meetings stay more private. They're meant to be private discussions of the government after all, but it also means that when we ask questions of the Prime Minister's spokesman about what happened in that meeting, all the Prime Minister's spokesman has to rely upon is what he was told by the Prime Minister or ministers in that meeting, and he creates the readout that way. It creates another little barrier to information there. Now, for the government, they may say that's necessary to stop leaks, but for a free and independent press, for many, that is a concern.
Tom, this is all very important, of course, because the markets are watching what's happening in the political arena, and they've taken fright, it seems, once more. I'm just looking at what the spokesman said. Downing Street saying there's no return to austerity under a Liz Truss government. But clearly there are question marks about how the Chancellor is going to balance the books.
There are certainly question marks, and the IFS has been pointing, the Institute for Fiscal Studies, I should say, has been pointing to around a 60 billion gap that would need to be met either by higher taxes or by reduced spending. Now, the government does seem to reject that idea, saying that economic growth can fill that gap, that by the middle of this decade, economic growth under their intention will have picked up, and that of course creates higher tax receipts without the need to raise taxes. However, many commentators have pointed to the fact that this seems to be a bit of a gamble on behalf of the government. If they can't get economic growth higher, if they can't tick up GDP growth to their target of 2.5% every year, then there is that gap in the budget that would need to be filled by spending cuts. However, I should say that the Prime Minister's spokesman is saying that they are not entertaining entertaining the idea of £60 billion in spending cuts. They do not want to return to austerity, as you said. This government is fixed on growth, growth, growth. Although I suppose the question there that arises after that is, if that growth doesn't materialise, what is plan B? For the moment, we don't have an answer.
Tom, we'll chat to you later in the show. Thanks for the update for now.
I do think it's worth mentioning, though, there is something going on the Labour Party side of things as well, and that's the deselection of Sam Tarry, the MP for Ilford South. This took place last night, and Sam Tarry has lost that selection battle. He lost it by 361 votes to 499, and it is really important to focus just briefly on this little bit of turmoil in the Ilford South Labour Party, because Sam Tarry is seen to be a Member of Parliament on the left of the party. Now, he's been replaced by a guy, or not replaced, but replaced as a candidate for the next election by a guy called Jas Athwal. This is a factional battle within the Labour Party between the left and the right, and it revisits a similar battle that took place in 2019 when the same two candidates battled it out for that seat. But Jas Athwal, the guy who has just been selected to fight that seat for the Labour Party next time round at the next general election, he was suspended from the Labour Party membership one night before that last selection by an NEC that was majority Corbynite. Now the NEC is majority Starmerite. That selection has flipped round. It's one to keep an eye on, because Sam Tarry, the current Member of Parliament who's just been deselected, has said that he wants to be assured of the integrity of the result, asking for full information about the electronic votes that were cast there. It's one to keep an eye on, and it does show a little bit of factional infighting there within the Labour Party.
We will keep an eye on that one. Thank you, Tom.
Or at least Tom will. Now, the latest figures for migrants crossing the Channel to reach the UK have just come in. We can tell you more than 35,000 embarking on that journey across the Channel, surpassing the total for all of 2021 by nearly 7,000.
There have been 2,232 crossings recorded in October so far, and on Monday alone, according to the Ministry of Defence, 13 boats were detected carrying some 539 people, taking the provisional total for the year to 35,233.
So, lots of figures, but this latest milestone coming as the government faces another legal challenge in its plan to send those migrants to Rwanda.
We'll bring you more on that as we get it. For now, a leading baby charity has exclusively told GB News that they're calling for mandatory third trimester scans for all mothers in a bid to prevent late loss and stillbirths.
Well, the announcement comes during Baby Loss Awareness Week. The charity called Abigail's Footsteps has also marked this week by releasing a short film. It's aimed at breaking the taboo surrounding baby loss, asking people just to say their baby's name.
Our reporter, Ellie Costello, went to meet a mother who lost her son Jackson in the late stages of pregnancy 2 years ago. She asked her how she remembers her late son.
I keep all these in my zip bags, so I don't want them to lose their smell.
Joanne Hanlon had a late miscarriage with her son Jackson in 2020. She was 6 months pregnant.
We actually struggled with fertility issues, so we was actually told that it would be a 1 in a million chance of us actually getting pregnant in the first place. So it was like a miracle baby. We was over the moon.
Joanne had to give birth to baby Jackson in hospital.
I guess you don't think about having to give birth to a baby who's not alive when you're pregnant. And it's a really difficult thing because part of you doesn't want to let them go. At the time, I just remember feeling like it was all my fault and I must have done something.
Well, estimates suggest that there are 250,000 miscarriages before 24 weeks in the UK each year. It's estimated that 1 in 5 pregnancies ends in miscarriage. Just over a year after Jackson's passing, Joanne gave birth to a happy and healthy baby boy, Theo.
This necklace has got one hoop for each child, and they've all got their birthstones on it, and that was a present for Christmas. And I like to do their handprints, and because one of the only things we've got of Jackson is his handprints and his footprints, so I like to do the kids' handprints and footprints so that he can still be included in things, because for us, he did exist.
Joanne says receiving counselling through a local charity, Abigail's Footsteps, helped her process her grief.
We lost Abigail back in 2009. She was 42 weeks gestation. The nursery was ready, the car seat was in the car. We were going to go into hospital, we were going to bring her home. And when we were told there was no heartbeat and, you know, we'd lost her, it was a tremendous shock.
Abigail's Footsteps charity are this week launching a new campaign for Baby Loss Awareness Week. It's called Say My Baby's Name.
Is this the room you were in before? Were you here with him?
It's okay. You can say my baby's name.
Were you here with Jordan?
Mum and Dad had that baby. That baby existed. Mum is a mum already. And please recognise that baby. Don't forget to say their name.
The charity is also calling for a mandatory third trimester scan for all mothers to try and prevent late loss and stillbirths.
And I'm hoping that we can push forward and make these things mandatory, that all mums can have a third scan and that we don't lose babies at 40, 41, 42 weeks as we did with Abigail. It shouldn't happen.
We put this suggestion to the Department of Health and Social Care. They said maternity safety is a priority and we are making progress to meet our target to halve the rates of stillbirth, neonatal and maternal deaths by 2025. We have invested £127 million into maternity services across the country. And the NHS has developed guidance for clinicians to reduce the risk of baby loss and better monitor pregnancies. Joanne hopes that by speaking about her son Jackson on Baby Loss Awareness Week, she can help other women feel like they can get the support they need too.
When you're going through that, it's really nice to have a support network around you that understands what you're going through, and being able to reach out to other people that have been through it has definitely helped me in my grieving process.
Ellie Costello, GB News.
Incredibly moving report there from Ellie. We're joined now by lawyer Keely Langthorne. Keely, good to see you during Baby Loss Awareness Week, which is a very personal as well as political event for you. Just describe, if you would, the trauma and loss that you have personally suffered when it comes to baby loss.
Thank you, Gloria. So I lost my son George in March at 22 and a half weeks. He was my third loss. Following George's death, it became very apparent to me that there was no statutory protection in place for anyone in terms of returning back to work. So as it currently stands, anyone who loses a baby under 24 weeks must return back to work the next day. So in circumstances like mine, I gave birth to a fully formed baby, George. I had a 6-hour birth with him, a 7-hour placental delivery with him. But the law says that I must go back to work the next day. As a result of that, I've started a national campaign to call on all employers to enact specialist miscarriage leave policies within their workplaces to try and assist women who are going through, women and men who are going through this traumatic experience and having to return back to work the next day.
You're saying that that's for dads as well as the mums, because clearly, you know, medical science develops. It doesn't seem that we are developing our approach in human terms as quickly as that.
Yeah, Matt, so it will apply to both, and it applies to modern families as well. So if you're going through surrogacy, if you're going through the adoption process and you lose a baby at that stage as well, it will apply to them as well. So I very much kept an eye on the New Zealand model last year. So in New Zealand, they adopt a policy whereby everyone in New Zealand, both parents, get 3 days statutory leave. As a result, I drafted a policy for my firm, which they enacted at the beginning of this year, and which I was unfortunately the first employee to use. That is now effective, and we're working on that. And loads of other firms have now come forward, not just legal businesses, but other firms, Channel 4, ASOS, all different businesses have come forward and said, we will enact this. As a result, I've also been working closely with Angela Crawley on the Miscarriage leave bill. So that had its first reading, which has been a success, but we're not due for a second reading now until the 2nd of December. So that will mirror the same as this policy, which is 3 days leave for men and women suffering a loss under 24 weeks.
About you, Keely, is that the trauma that you have undergone, it's turned you into a campaigner for better provision for other people who go through that trauma, and you're using Parliament to do that and working with politicians, aren't you, and campaigning with politicians to get it on, to get the law changed. How have you found that?
Yeah, it's been really difficult. I can't believe, Laura, that we're in a time in 2022 where we're only just looking at this now. Like, I'm astonished that the law in its current form says that you have a baby and you leave that deceased baby at a mortuary and you go back to work the next day. I can't believe we are where we are, but yes, I am working closely with MPs. We've had lots of round tables. I'm encouraging all MPs to support Angela Crawley in the second meeting so that we can get this statutory provision in place. Now, I agree wholeheartedly with what Angela Crawley MP is saying in that reform of UK employment law is long overdue and statutory miscarriage leave must form a part of this. Now, we talk time and time again about well-being in the workplace, but this comes to the heart and core of that, and it must be at the forefront of employers' minds and of MPs' minds now, and they must support this bill.
Keely, thanks very much indeed for joining us once more, bringing us your story, and of course keep us updated on how the campaign is going as well. Thanks very much indeed.
You are watching GB Newsday with me and Mark. Lots more to come over the next 2 hours, but time now for a short break.
Weekday afternoons on GB News, we've got the whole of the UK covered. From 12 to 3, it's GB Newsday with me, Mark Longhurst.
And me, Gloria De Piero. You'll get the very latest on everything that's been going on across our great nation.
And from 3 till 6, watch out for GB News Live with me, Patrick Christie. I'm not here to mess around with all the biggest topics and guests. You will always be up to date. GB Newsday and GB News Live from 12 p.m.
Only on GB News.
The People's Channel, Britain's news channel.
Hello there, it's Eamon Holmes here from Breakfast on GB News. We're not just on your television and your screens, you know.
We're on DAB plus digital radio, so you can listen to your favourite shows on the move.
If you've not yet listened to GB News Radio, it's very simple. We're on your radio player and TuneIn apps, on your smart speaker, phone or tablet, or online at gbnews.uk.
Take us with you wherever you go. GB News Radio.
You never have to miss a moment of the People's Channel.
Join my show Farage, 7 p.m. till 8 p.m. Monday through Thursday. And there you will get opinion, analysis, debate, and I'll cover stories that nobody else dares to touch.
You've been cancelled. Join the club.
Oh, my goodness me. And then for the last 15 minutes, talking pints. We're over a drink. We have a civilised conversation with someone. We very often disagree, but we do it in a grown-up way. Come and join me on Farage.
Hello, I'm Simon Evans. Join me on GB News for Headliners at 11 p.m, where I'll be joined by two of the country's top comedians as we take a look at tomorrow's newspapers tonight. If it's a big story, we'll be covering it, I guarantee, but we'll also have some fun along the way. That's GB News Headliners at 11 p.m. We won't put you to sleep, unlike some of the other paper review shows out there. So join us, 11 p.m, 7 nights a week.
A very good afternoon to you. It is 2 minutes past 1. I'm Rosie Wright, keeping you up to date on GB News. The Bank of England have bought more government debt, having warned again there's a risk to the UK's financial stability. Well, initially forced to act to counter turmoil in the markets after the announcement of the Chancellor's mini-budget, the bank's now expanding its bond buying in an effort, they say, to restore orderly market conditions. The bank warned that a sell-off of government bonds posed material risk, and they say they've acted to prevent dysfunction in the market. Number 10 say the Prime Minister remains committed to the measures set out in the mini-budget, despite the bank's intervention. Well, the Chancellor will have to find spending cuts of more than £60 billion if he wants to convince investors he can get the public finances back under control. That's the analysis of a leading economic think tank, the Institute for Fiscal Studies. Well, Kwasi Kwarteng is going to appear in the Commons shortly and face questions from MPs about his plans. The Labour Party are calling for the government to reverse some of the decisions in that mini-budget. Shadow Chief Secretary to the Treasury, Pat McFadden, told us the government's strategy is wrong. We'll bring that to you shortly. Now, moving on, the Prime Minister will urge G7 leaders today to remain steadfast in support of Ukraine during crisis talks this afternoon. Liz Truss and her Ukrainian counterpart will join a virtual meeting of world leaders. It's after Russia launched its most significant attack on Ukraine in months. Missile strikes hit Kyiv and other cities, killing at least 19 people and injuring more than 100. Further air raid sirens have been heard this morning in the capital, amid warnings of further Russian missile attacks. The Ukrainian MP, Alexei Goncharo, told GB News President Putin's actions are an act of war.
All these wars against civilian areas, this was an act of terror. So Putin tries to threaten Ukrainians, but this will not happen. We are not afraid of Putin. We showed it to the whole world. And from this point of view, this was absolutely useless attack for Putin, but also it was a huge criminal crime, war crime from Russia.
The head of Britain's intelligence agency, GCHQ, says Ukraine is successfully turning the tide against Russian forces despite the recent attacks. In a speech today, Sir Jeremy Fleming will say Russian gains are being reversed in a staggering cost to the Kremlin. Meanwhile, the UK's ambassador to the UN, Dame Barbara Woodward, last night repeated her calls for Russia to end the war.
Putin is trying to take Ukraine's land, its resources, its identity. In doing so, he is overturning the most sacred principle in the international system, that borders cannot be drawn by force.
The Scottish Government has told the Supreme Court it's in the public interest to resolve the issue of whether Holyrood can hold a second referendum on independence. Scotland's top law officer is putting forward the case for an independence referendum without the support of Westminster. First Minister Nicola Sturgeon says she wants to be able to hold an indisputably lawful vote. Well, 2 days have been set aside for the hearing. The UK government are expected to respond tomorrow. Unemployment in the UK has dropped to its lowest rate in over 50 years. Figures from the ONS say the rate fell to 3.5% to the 3 months to August. However, wages are failing to keep up with the rising cost of living. There's also been a record rise in the number of people off work or not looking for work because of long-term sickness. The first of the funerals for the victims of the service station explosion in County Donegal in Ireland are taking place today. A service for 24-year-old designer Jessica Gallagher is taking place at St Michael's Church. She's one of 10 people who were killed in a suspected gas explosion on Friday. Ireland's police force believe the blast was an accident and they're investigating the potential cause. Sinn Féin's Vice President, Michelle O'Neill, paid tribute to the community, saying her thoughts are with the families of the victims.
This has been devastating. As the local priest said, it's random. But it's happened to so many people and so many people have been left bereaved and so many are injured. So I think that it's important to show solidarity and support to the people here at Freesat at what is just such a tragic time.
Just Stop Oil protesters blocked some emergency vehicles as part of their demonstration in London this morning. Well, a fire engine and an ambulance on blue lights were initially unable to get through the demonstrators until they did then pause to let them pass. Well, campaigning for the UK government to stop using and developing fossil fuels, the group have caused disruption to major thoroughfares in central London over the last 11 days. You're up to date now on GB News. I'll bring you up to speed as it happens. Now let's head back to Newsday.
Rosie, thanks very much indeed. Welcome back to GB Newsday. Let's just update you, actually, with a bit of reaction to what we saw in the news bulletin there on that fire engine. We're learning that the government has called that action as unacceptable after both the fire engine and ambulance were apparently obstructed in that protest. Prime Minister's official spokesman saying these sorts of protests which disrupt people's daily lives or indeed stop emergency services from potentially saving lives unacceptable, which is why we've already toughened powers for the police and given them powers to act. We will be taking further powers through the House to ensure they can go even further in preventing these individuals from disrupting people's lives. So that's the official reaction in the past few minutes to what we saw those scenes in London a little earlier.
The time is just coming up to 8 minutes past 1. You're watching GB Newsday with Mark Longhurst and me, Gloria De Piero.
Bank of England warning once more of a risk to the UK's financial stability. It's made yet another urgent intervention in the financial markets.
The Chancellor's due to answer MPs' questions at about 2:35 as a major think tank today says the government needs to find another £62 billion in savings to balance the country's books.
In other news coming up, Britain's doctors warning us that the health of the British population declining. Inequalities are widening. Our life expectancy is flatlining, we're being told.
And politicians finally get back to work today in Parliament. It's the battle of the Chancellor and his opposite number over his Halloween budget. Will it be trick or treat in the Commons in 2:30?
And the Scottish Government's launched an effort in the Supreme Court to win a second independence referendum without Westminster's approval. So will the UK's top court rule on a disunited kingdom?
And as ever, we want to hear from you at home, so please get in touch with us on all of today's big stories. GBviews at gbnews.uk. We will read out your thoughts before the end of the show.
So, the Chancellor due to face MPs after the Bank of England's made another dramatic intervention, warning of a material risk to financial stability once more.
And also something for the Chancellor Kwasi Kwarteng to think about. An influential think tank has today warned that he needs to find £62 billion or reverse his tax cuts to get the UK's finances back under control.
Let's get the latest now with our economics and business editor Liam Halligan with On the Money. Welcome once more with figures and initials flying all over the place, and we're trying to make sense of it, as indeed Kwasi Kwarteng will a little later. There's a lot for him to digest, isn't there?
There is. He'll be up in front of the Treasury Select Committee. Even the chairman of the Select Committee, while he's in the same party, is not necessarily his ally. The chairman of the Treasury Select Committee, Mel Stride, was Rishi Sunak's campaign manager. And a lot of people on the Tory backbenches think that maybe the Tory leadership isn't as secure as it looked just a few weeks ago. What I wanted to do is just update viewers and listeners. I've got some graphics here. And because, as you say rightly, Mark, there's lots of interest rates flying around. There's lots of acronyms flying around. So let's just cast our mind back. Over 3 weeks ago now, it was the 22nd of September that the Bank of England raised interest rates. I remember sitting in this seat reporting it to 2.25%. They went up from 1.75%, so that's 0.5% up. Some people thought they'd go up more. But anyway, they went up to 2.25%, which is still ultra low by historic standards, but is higher than it's been. And at that moment, what I'm calling here the money markets interest rate, that's the 10-year gilt rate, that's the rate at which the government borrows money for 10 years, that's 3.49%, so quite a lot higher than the Bank of England's base rate. And the base rate and then the money markets rate, the gilt rate, they set the benchmark for commercial rates that you and I use, Mark, when we try and get a mortgage, when we take out a personal loan. Those rates are always higher. But that money market rate was 3.49% back on the 22nd of September. Then you had the mini, not so mini budget on the 23rd of September, the next day. And what happened? A lot of people panicked that there was too much tax cuts in it. A lot of people panicked that maybe the government wouldn't be able to make the sums add up. The pound fell. There was a lot of political ram-raiding, if you like, saying that it's going to be terrible. A lot of catastrophism, in my view. But anyway, what that's done is it's pushed up those money market interest rates now. And I've put the word now on the graphic for GB News audience who are watching on television, because it literally is changing every hour of every day. 4.44%. That's a lot higher than the 3.49% it was before the mini budget. And that's why you're getting these higher interest rates rippling out throughout the economy. Just a final, another graph for the moment. This is the average mortgage rate each month in 2022. And this is a composite rate. You know, it depends how long the mortgage is and what kind of lender you are, what kind of borrower you are, how much deposit. But these are the average rates. You'll see there, look how much they've gone up anyway, from just over 3.5% on average in January to over 4.5% in September. So there's already a long upward trend. Now, of course, in the red box, they're approximately 6% because what's going on money markets has increased the price of people who are getting new mortgages or people with fixed mortgages that are coming to the end of the fix and they need to re-mortgage. And this is the problem, Mark. All this financial stuff, all this money market stuff, it has real-world implications.
It does. And this morning, as they do every weekday morning, the Prime Minister's official spokesperson takes questions from what's known as lobby journalists, the political journalists. And he was asked, how are you going to balance the books, given all the figures that you have just outlined? And what he said was there will be no return to austerity under a Liz Truss government. Now, austerity is something we associate with Osborne and Cameron, deep cuts to public spending. So she says she's not going to get the money back in that way. Is that realistic?
What that amounts to is a doubling down on growth, because either you spend less, right, or you don't go ahead with your tax cuts, which will be a reversal of this mini budget. I don't think they want to do that. Or you say, actually, we're going to make all the numbers add up by growing the cake, by having a bigger pie that we can then spread out. And then you'll get more revenue if there's more growth, more economic activity. You'll need less government spending because the private sector will be going like the clappers. It strikes me that, you know, if the Prime Minister's spokesman had said we're going to go back to austerity, then, you know, Westminster would have a meltdown. There'd be sort of...
The markets might have been, good.
Blood-curdling headlines. But not really, because the markets know, right? The markets know that the political class actually knows very little about finance. Even under austerity, public spending went up enormously and government debt went up enormously. It just went up by less than it otherwise would.
And that's the issue, is when we look at these figures that you've put on those graphics, the government is having to borrow at these higher rates as well. So
that's
the
right.
government debt
when I
is
talked
going
about
up.
Money market interest rate, that is the government, the interest rate the government faces when it tries to borrow money for 10 years.
So we've got the Institute of Fiscal Studies now saying, actually, he needs to find another 62 billion to balance the books. Now, I know you're saying that they look at, you know, a very small prism on that, but it indicates why perhaps the markets are taking such fright at these figures.
Sure. And of course the markets are frightened because, well, they're not frightened. They're going to lend the British government money. It's one of the most, you know, respectable creditors, borrowers in the world.
Yeah.
I mean, our debt is still rated...
It's just the price they extract for
AA minus, which is one off, you know, AAA, which is like the Swiss and so on. We're often at AA minus because we're a sort of much more swashbuckling economy. But you're right, Mark, it's the price. And the price at which the government borrows money, with the Bank of England interest rate below it, that sets the benchmark. You can't offer mortgages for less than that. The government is obviously gets the cheapest borrowing in the country because it is the government, because in the end it can just create the money if it needs to, so you'll get your money back. But it's all about the price. And as the price of credit goes up, not just mortgages and personal loans, it's business loans as well. And that slows down the economy. That makes it harder for her to get the growth that she needs, the Prime Minister.
Liam, as ever, thank you for that, and we'll see how that figure develops with your graphs. You might have to put a few more figures in this later.
Get the crayons out and update them.
Thank you very much.
Well, as we were discussing, the Chancellor of the Exchequer, Kwasi Kwarteng, will have to plug a £60 billion hole in the public finances with steep spending cuts or a tax raid. Well, according to the Institute of Fiscal Studies, Liam also pointed out that they could do this if we got economic growth. But...
Yes, well, the think tank saying that deep austerity measures, as they call them, would be needed to stabilise debt in the medium term. So it's forecasting, just to explain this, a £1,500, £1,500 hit to households from those surging interest rates.
The Shadow Chief Secretary to the Treasury, Pat McFadden, spoke to GB News earlier today to give his reaction.
Since the mini-budget was announced a couple of weeks ago, we've had chaos in the financial markets. You've had an emergency Bank of England intervention to prop up the pension system, and probably the most direct effect of all for people has been a really sharp spike in mortgage rates, where the 2-year fixed rate is often now above 6%, which is the highest it's been for 15 years. And so you've had all of that effect, and it looks as though to try to compensate for all of that, what the government's going to do now is announce a whole series of public spending cuts in this Halloween fiscal event at the end of the month. And you know, this doesn't make sense to make one set of mistakes and then compound it by making the public pay for ministers' mistakes through cuts in public services. It'd be far better to pause this whole thing and revisit the mistakes that caused the market chaos in the first place. The government's contempt for their own Office for Budget Responsibility, their sacking of the Treasury Permanent Secretary on the Chancellor's first day in the job, their tension with the Bank of England, all of this stuff about showing contempt for the institutions which safeguard our economic credibility has contributed to the market reaction and to the spike in mortgage rates. So it's good that they've commissioned an OBR report, but what really matters here is their own policies, and all the indications are that they are now panicking because of the market reaction to what they announced a couple of weeks ago, and that panic will result in deep cuts in public services.
That was Pat McFadden from the Labour Party speaking to Breakfast this morning here on GB News.
Giving his view. What about your view? Lots of you emailing about what the Bank of England has had to do and the state of the economy, of course. Andy, first of all, why do we allow these institutions to push the lefty propaganda of always talking our country down? It is this that costs us billions, question mark? Is it the single-sided predictions backed up by the lefty government institutions, including the Bank of England? I think some may argue the Bank of England is not particularly lefty. That puts us in the state we are in. Just let the markets get on with it and intervene only if there's a problem, not try to fix a problem before it exists.
Andrew says no mention whatsoever of the Fed's upcoming interest rate increase or German gilt's highest for 20 years, and the budget increases the tax take by £21 billion by fiscal drag. Good point.
Yes, that's, of course, your allowances, your tax allowances and thresholds. Quite technical. You're quite expert out there, aren't you? You're sort of keeping us on the ball. Paul, next. No one mentions Sunak's massive spending and borrowing, or burrowing, as it says there, but Truss and Kwarteng are getting the fallout! Exclamation mark. Keep them coming.
After the break, a warning from British doctors that there's been a decline in the population's health and a widening in health inequalities. And we'll have the latest from our political correspondent, Tom Howard, who is in Westminster.
Let's take a short break.
Weekday afternoons on GB News, we've got the whole of the UK covered. From 12 to 3, it's GB Newsday with me, Mark Longhurst.
And me, Gloria De Piero. You'll get the very latest on everything that's been going on across our great nation.
And from 3 till 6, watch out for GB News Live with me, Patrick Christie. I'm not here to mess around with all the biggest topics and guests. You will always be up to date. GB Newsday and GB News Live from 12 p.m.
Only on GB News.
The People's Channel, Britain's news channel.
Hello there, it's Eamon Holmes here from Breakfast on GB News. We're not just on your television and your screens, you know.
We're on DAB plus digital radio, so you can listen to your favourite shows on the move.
If you've not yet listened to GB News Radio, it's very simple. We're on your radio player and TuneIn apps, on your smart speaker, phone or tablet, or online at gbnews.uk.
Take us with you wherever you go. GB News Radio.
You never have to miss a moment of the People's Channel.
Join my show Farage, 7 p.m. till 8 p.m. Monday through Thursday. And there you will get opinion, analysis, debate, and I'll cover stories that nobody else dares to touch.
You've been cancelled. Join the club.
Oh, my goodness me. And then for the last 15 minutes, talking pints. We're over a drink. We have a civilised conversation with someone. We very often disagree, but we do it in a grown-up way. Come and join me on Farage.
Hello, Hello, I'm Simon Evans. Join me on GB News for Headliners at 11 p.m, where I'll be joined by two of the country's top comedians as we take a look at tomorrow's newspapers tonight. If it's a big story, we'll be covering it, I guarantee, but we'll also have some fun along the way. That's GB News Headliners at 11 p.m. We won't put you to sleep, unlike some of the other paper review shows out there. So join us, 11 p.m, 7 nights a week.
In just over an hour's time, at 2:30, Chancellor Kwasi Kwarteng will be facing MPs at Treasury questions. MPs have been off for ages, so it's a big event. Questions still hanging over that so-called mini-budget, and the Institute for Fiscal Studies warning that he needs to find another £62 billion.
Let's get the latest with our political correspondent Tom Harwood in Westminster, who's been at the lobby briefing. And Tom, interesting that we understand that they weren't discussing what the Bank of England has done in terms of intervening in the money markets, but they did discuss the overall picture, saying there won't be a return to austerity.
Yes, that's right. When it comes to the formal cabinet meeting this morning, of course chaired by the Prime Minister, the readout that we have been given suggests that they did not talk about the intervention by the Bank of England, but instead the overarching growth strategy of this government, the principle behind the decisions that this government is taking in the round to boost UK GDP growth up to 2.5% per year. Now, if they achieve that, they'll be able to fund all sorts of things without the need for raising taxes. It plugs a lot of the gaps that independent observers have been warning about in the UK fiscal situation. However, it must be said there was what's called political cabinet before official cabinet this morning. It lasted for around 45 minutes, and within that we are not told what was discussed by cabinet ministers in a political rather than a governmental context. Now, that could well have discussed interventions by the Bank of England, could well have discussed volatility in the bond markets, could well have discussed all sorts of things, but I'm afraid, and it's a shame for really openness within government, that these sort of discussions stay behind closed doors.
And talking about volatility in the markets, but there's also been volatility in the Conservative Party. Do you sense a desire, a sort of a hope of calm and a willingness for, actually, Liz Truss's own MPs, she's only been in the job for a month or so, to get behind her?
Speaking to quite a few MPs, it must be said most of the MPs I've spoken to were originally backers of Liz Truss. They are very, very keen that Parliament doesn't, or that the Conservative Party in Parliament doesn't divide itself. They think that that is one of the big reasons why the polls have taken such a big dive against the Conservative Party, and if the party were more united and presented their arguments in a united way, the polls wouldn't be so dire for their party. However, on the other side of the ledger, the sort of rump of Sunak backers, and it must be said not all of the Sunak backers, some of them are saying get with the team. Of course, we saw the appointment of Greg Hands to become a trade minister, of course a prominent backer of Rishi Sunak, but it must be said that there are some MPs who think, well, we've won on getting the government to U-turn over the 45p tax rate cut. We think we might be winning over getting the government to back down over proposals to only uplift benefits in line with average wages rather than inflation. What else can they grab? That's certainly going to be in the back of the minds of quite a few MPs. But this week is crucial for the Prime Minister. Not only will she be putting across what she's doing on the world stage, as we speak, the Prime Minister is on the phone on a video conference to President Biden, President Macron, Prime Minister Trudeau, President Zelensky and other G7 leaders in a G7 call about the energy crisis and indeed the war in Ukraine. No doubt she'll be putting out words about that as soon as that call is over. But also, of course, the Chancellor standing up on his feet in less than an hour's time, talking to a pretty rowdy House of Commons, no doubt, about the financial situation of the country. And then tomorrow, not only Prime Minister's questions, but also a crucial 1922 committee meeting addressed by the Prime Minister. That's the backbenchers of the Conservative Party behind closed doors, grilling the Prime Minister on the entirety of government policy and indeed her approach to governance too. So 2 very important days, today and tomorrow, for the Prime Minister to try and get that party more united, and some very crucial contact points, both for Liz Truss and her next door neighbour Kwasi Kwarteng, in order to try and put forward that agenda that they're going for, try and sell the growth plan, try and say that they're sticking to the course and bring in their MPs behind them. It'll be a very tough 2 days to get those MPs on side and on message.
Starts at 2:30 as well. Tom, for the moment, thank you, and we'll be back to the House of Commons as the Chancellor answers those Treasury questions. But let's move on now to another story with a huge shortfall in parking spaces, forcing thousands of HGV drivers to sleep in unsafe conditions overnight.
Fresh analysis into a government report by the Press Association news agency found that designated truck stops and motorway services lack the space for a fifth of the lorries that park overnight near major roads in England.
Well, it's just one of several issues plaguing the haulage industry, including fuel prices, of course, and a long-standing shortage of drivers. With more on this, our East Midlands reporter Will Hollis joins us from a truck stop at junction 23 of the M1. They're having a pretty torrid time out there, it seems, Will.
Yes, very much so. We're just outside of Junction 23 on the M1. This is Junction 23's cafe, and you can see it's a little bit quieter, obviously, because drivers are working up and down the country along motorways and A roads, making sure that all of the goods for businesses, for agriculture, for shops are getting to where they need to be. And while it's a little bit quieter now, 180 spaces here will most likely be full by 7 o'clock tonight. I was speaking to one HGV driver that said he doesn't even bother going to a truck stop like this if it's anywhere near 7 p.m. because at that time they are completely full. What would you get at a place like this? Well, you get a few things. You get toilets, you get showers, you get some hot food as well, but you get security, you get a little bit of peace of mind because of a night watchman and CCTV. But when you can't get into a place like this, of course you've got to find somewhere else to park your truck for the night, and that's where the problems are for most HGV drivers, because they're in industrial sites, in lay-bys, and that means that there can be a problem for criminals being targeted by criminal gangs, but there can also be a problem for residents as well who maybe can't get out of their drive to work. So I was speaking to one HGV driver who was parked here last night about some of the problems he faces within the industry.
The lorry driver has to park in the industrial estate or lay-by on the tide road, which is not the most safe roads for sleeping overnight. It's not safe for you, it's not safe for your cargo. With the people which is looking to steal diesel from HGVs. And another thing is, if you are parked in the lay-by overnight, so many cars or lorries will pass you all the night. The cabin will still keep moving, and in the morning you will be tired, very tired. And the next day, I don't think you are too good to work a full day.
Well, there's a Department for Transport study looking into the last 5 years of parking spaces like this, and it analysed places where there were critical levels of shortages. Here in the East Midlands, 92% of parking spaces at these designated HGV sites are full every single night. It's even worse in the east of England and in the southeast as well, where you might have big container ports as well. Now, the Department for Transport, in wake of all of these shortages for drivers and parking spaces, has said that the Department for Transport spokeswoman said we've taken unprecedented action to tackle the global HGV driver shortage, including investing over 52 million to improve roadside facilities and lorry parking. The funding is going for eating and showering facilities, enhanced security and more parking spaces. Of course, it is a really difficult time to be a HGV driver because there's a sheer reliance on it, but there are problems to do with fuel shortages as well as driver shortages. And you can only imagine what it is like living in some of those conditions on the road and making that decision to work away from your family so that you can pay those bills but then at times when you see that you can't get into places just like this where you might be a little bit more safe, a little bit more secure, it can be quite disheartening for the people that are driving for Britain's roads.
Very tough indeed, Will. Thank you for bringing us that report.
Now, coming up, is Russia's invasion of Ukraine becoming increasingly desperate? Are they actually running out of ammunition and missiles? We'll have the views of one of Britain's leading security experts. First, though, an update on the news bulletin with Rosie.
Good afternoon, it's 1:32. I'm Rosie Wright, keeping you up to date. Now, the Bank of England have bought government debt, more government debt, having warned again there's a risk to the UK's financial stability. Initially forced to act to counter turmoil in the markets after the Chancellor's mini-budget, the bank is now expanding its bond buying in an effort to say they restore orderly market conditions. The bank warned that a sell-off of government bonds posed a material risk and say they've acted to prevent dysfunction in the market. Number 10 say the Prime Minister remains committed to the measures set out in the mini-budget, despite the bank's intervention. Well, the Chancellor will have to find spending cuts of more than £60 billion if he wants to convince investors that he can get the public finances back under control. That's the analysis of a leading economic think tank, the Institute for Fiscal Studies. Kwasi Kwarteng will appear in the Commons this afternoon and face questions from MPs about his fiscal plans. The Prime Minister Liz Truss has urged G7 leaders this afternoon to remain steadfast in support of Ukraine during crisis talks. It's after Russia launched its most significant attack on Ukraine in months. Missile strikes hit Kyiv and other cities, killing at least 19 people and injuring more than 100. More air raid sirens have been heard this morning in the capital amid warnings of further Russian missile attacks. The head of Britain's intelligence agency, GCHQ, says Ukraine is successfully turning the tide against Russian forces despite recent attacks. In a speech later today, Sir Jeremy Fleming will say Russian gains are being reversed in a staggering cost to the Kremlin. The Scottish Government's told the Supreme Court it's in the public interest to resolve the issue of whether Holyrood can hold a second referendum on independence without Westminster's approval. Scotland's top law officer is putting forward the case for a referendum without the support from the UK Government. The First Minister, Nicola Sturgeon, says she wants to be able to hold an indisputably lawful vote. 2 days have been set aside for the hearing, and the UK Government are expected to respond tomorrow. The government have said the Just Stop Will protest that blocked some emergency vehicles this morning was unacceptable. A fire engine and an ambulance on blue lights were initially unable to get through until the demonstrators paused to let them pass. Campaigning for the UK government to stop using and developing fossil fuels, the group have caused disruption to major thoroughfares in central London over the last 11 days. TV, online, and we're on your DAB+ radio. It's GB News.
Weekday afternoons on GB News, we've got the whole of the UK covered. From 12 to 3, it's GB Newsday with me, Mark Longhurst.
And me, Gloria De Piero. You'll get the very latest on everything that's been going on across our great nation.
And from 3 till 6, watch out for GB News Live with me, Patrick Christie. I'm not here to mess around with all the biggest topics and guests. You will always be up to date. GB Newsday and GB News Live from 12 p.m.
Only on GB News.
The People's Channel, Britain's news channel.
Hello there, it's Eamon Holmes here from Breakfast on GB News. We're not just on your television and your screens, you know.
We're on DAB plus digital radio, so you can listen to your favourite shows on the move.
If you've not yet listened to GB News Radio, it's very simple. We're on your radio player and TuneIn apps, on your smart speaker, phone or tablet, or online at gbnews.uk.
Take us with you wherever you go. GB News Radio.
You never have to miss a moment of the People's Channel.
Join my show Farage, 7 p.m. till 8 p.m. Monday through Thursday. And there you will get opinion, analysis, debate, and I'll cover stories that nobody else dares to touch.
You've been cancelled. Join the club.
Oh my goodness me. And then for the last 15 minutes, talking pints. We're over a drink. We have a civilised conversation with someone. We very often disagree, but we do it in a grown-up way. Come and join me on Farage.
Hello, I'm Simon Evans. Join me on GB News for Headliners at 11 p.m, where I'll be joined by two of the country's top comedians as we take a look at tomorrow's newspapers tonight. If it's a big story, we'll be covering it, I guarantee, but we'll also have some fun along the way. That's GB News Headliners at 11 p.m. We won't put you to sleep, unlike some of the other paper review shows out there. So join us, 11 p.m, 7 nights a week.
It's 1:37, you're with GB Newsday. One of Britain's leading security experts claimed that Russia's military campaign in Ukraine is becoming increasingly desperate.
Yes, Jeremy Fleming, who's the head of the UK's GCHQ intelligence gathering agency, says that Russia still had a very capable military machine, but it was running short of weapons, allies and troops.
It comes as Prime Minister Liz Truss is holding a virtual meeting with G7 world leaders, including President Zelensky, this afternoon to discuss the war in Ukraine.
Well, on the ground, missiles have still been striking Ukraine, causing fires in Zaporizhia, southern region of Ukraine, with parts of Lviv in the west still without electricity after further strikes this morning.
Belarusian and Russian troops are now on the border of Ukraine. President Alexander Lukashenko has said that this is only a defensive measure.
Let's get the views now of Vladimir Yermolenko, who's a Ukrainian journalist, chief editor, indeed, of Ukraine World. Thank you very much indeed for joining us. Can you just update us, Vladimir, on the situation on the ground? We understand that Lviv has been hit again this morning, and it may be these are attacks on the infrastructure, the energy and water sectors.
Exactly, Russians are hitting the Ukrainian infrastructure, so the civilian infrastructure. They want Ukrainian cities to be without electricity, without heating and without water. There were air raid sirens, air alerts were, I think, for 6 hours this morning across Ukraine. The whole territory of Ukraine was covered with this, and we in Kyiv were also kind of prepared for new strikes. But apparently lots of missiles were intercepted by Ukrainian air defense, which doesn't mean that Ukrainian air defense can cope with everything. Yesterday, one of the most horrible mornings since the beginning of this full-scale invasion. Out of 83 missiles launched by Russians, Ukrainians downed about 45. But as you can see, half of them, about 40-something, have hit the targets.
And Liz Truss, our Prime Minister, along with other world leaders, G7 leaders, are meeting. Our Prime Minister expected to urge leaders to stand firm in support of Ukraine following those missile attacks. What is it that President Zelensky will be asking for?
He will certainly be asking for modern anti-air defense systems, because, as I told you, Ukrainians are very smart and very intelligent to down many Russian missiles, but when there is a massive strikes, like 80 missiles, 100 missiles at the same time, I think it's very difficult for Ukrainian air defense to cope with everything. And of course, Ukraine needs more. And the more air defense systems we got, the lesser casualties, the lesser civilians will die, the less problems will be for Ukrainian civilian infrastructure, the less problems will be for Ukrainian heating during winter, during very harsh winters that we have. And of course, we need more long-range weapons to counterattack, to proceed with our counteroffensive. The military expert that you quoted was absolutely right. Russians are becoming desperate. They understand that they cannot reach success on the ground. And actually, yesterday's and today's attack are a message rather for the Russian population, which are increasingly desperate to see that Russian army is just having complete disaster on the ground in Ukraine, and just to send them a message that no, we are strong, we can hit civilian targets, we can kill Ukrainian civilians with our missiles, and therefore Russia is, still a military power, which is, of course, it's a lie.
And is there an assessment there that this could change if Ukraine, as you say, goes on the offensive rather than mounting defensive operations? In that could actually, in a way, work to Putin's favour, that he can point to NATO trying to encourage Ukraine to attack Russia itself?
Well, Putin is telling Russians that NATO is attacking Russia since 2014. If you look at the Russian propaganda, they were saying that they are waging the war not against Ukraine, but against NATO. So I don't know what should happen next, to give him more cards. He already have all his cards on his hands, and he launched an aggressive invasion against Ukraine. Ukraine has counteracted very skillfully, and the decisiveness of Ukrainians is to continue this counteroffensive. So we really do not need to think in terms of how not to provoke Putin, but we need to think how Ukraine, Europe, the free world can win this war.
Vladimir Yermolenko, thank you very much for joining us live there in Kyiv, editor of Ukraine World. Thanks for your time here on GB Newsday.
The time is 1:42. Britain's highest court is to determine the future of a second referendum for Scottish independence. Today, the Supreme Court has started this hearing to decide if the Scottish Government can hold that referendum without permission from Westminster and that it be lawful.
Well, so far we can tell you the court's been told that the holding of referendums not a matter reserved to Westminster and that it is, quote, exceptional importance, as they say that the referendum's question is resolved. Well, this, of course, follows the First Minister, Nicola Sturgeon, and her speech yesterday at the NSP party conference in Aberdeen. Our political editor, Darren McCaffrey, has the details.
In Scotland, the battle for the future of Britain has not gone away. After success in last year's Holyrood elections, the SNP argued they're determined not to give up on the hope of independence.
Whether it's Tory or Labour, Labour or Tory, it's not us who gets to decide. Our votes don't determine who gets to occupy number 10. For Scotland, the problem is not just which party is in power at Westminster. The problem is Westminster.
But ultimately, the decision for a second referendum is currently not theirs to take. That's why the battle is moving to London and to here, the UK's Supreme Court, who will decide if MPs at Westminster or MSPs in Edinburgh should have the final say on another vote.
But what if the decision doesn't go their way? Well, that leaves Nicola Sturgeon and the SNP with two big problems. First of all, what do they do next, particularly when the Prime Minister, Liz Truss, has made it clear that she thinks there shouldn't be another vote anytime soon? And second of all, while the polls are pretty divided on independence, evenly split, only a third of Scots think that now is the right time for another referendum.
A lot of people expect the Supreme Court to rule against that, and if that's the case, she said that she'll try to turn the next general election into a de facto referendum. Whether she can actually do that, I mean, who can, after all, decide what is the issues of an election campaign? So there's doubts over whether it actually will be a de facto referendum. But I think what Nicola Sturgeon is maybe trying to do on that as well is to retain relevance, to try to ensure that her supporters don't vote for Labour instead. So by raising the issue of independence, she might be able to hold on to those pro-independence votes.
But for most SNP activists, Nicola Sturgeon must not relent.
We will use the Westminster election, the next Westminster election. If the Supreme Court says no, that will be used as a plebiscite referendum. We have that right under international law.
Are you frustrated, though?
With the UK government, absolutely. As she said at the weekend, if they are so confident, why not just let it go ahead?
What should she do next? What do you want to see her do next?
Well, she said she's going to use it for the next general election.
Do you think that's going to work, though?
I'm not sure. I'm not really sure. But I hope so. But let's wait and see what the Supreme Court says. Then we'll make a judgment, I think.
For the moment, focus will now be on the Supreme Court's hearing. With a judgment due to take months, this drawn-out battle is not likely to conclude anytime soon, to the frustration of nearly everyone on every side of the debate. Darren McCaffrey, GB News, Aberdeen.
Well, indeed, that was the picture in Aberdeen. What about the picture in London? Our national reporter Paul Hawkins at the Supreme Court, which is discussing this issue. And Paul, you were indicating that the lawyers used the rather indelicate phrase, festering issue, a little earlier.
Yeah, that's right, Mark. Yeah, festering issue. Now, that was a quote from Lord Mackay of Drumadoon, and the festering issue that he was referring to, this is going back years, and that phrase repeated by Dorothy Bain KC, the Scottish Government's top legal officer, The festering issue is whether the Supreme Court should decide on whether the Scottish Government has the authority to introduce legislation for a referendum without the say-so of Westminster. That has been the ongoing festering issue, and so Dorothy Bain was saying, look, to the judges, the 5 judges of the Supreme Court that are hearing this case, yes, you need to clear up this festering issue. I do have the authority to bring this question to you, to put it to you, for you to answer one way or the other, and that we need to clear up this ambiguity. Now, the case from the UK government is that, look, when it comes to bills, when it comes to certain pieces of legislation, the top legal officer in the Scottish Government doesn't have the authority to take it to the Supreme Court. But she was saying in court this morning, look, this isn't actually a bill, this is pre-introductory legislation. We haven't even introduced it to the Scottish Government yet. It's not actually technically a bill yet. So we want to run this past the Supreme Court first and find out what they think before we then introduce it to the Scottish Parliament. Now, we're talking about the Scotland Act from 1998 earlier on, and that gives a list of questions that the Lord Advocate, the top legal advisor in the Scottish Government, can refer to the Supreme Court, and none of them talk about a referendum. But there is one clause there that says any other question arising by virtue or about reserved matters can be referred to the Supreme Court. So that is what Dorothy Bain, the Scottish Government's top legal officer, was saying. That's why she can refer it to this court. Now, she did mention as well the referendum itself, if it were to come about, and she stressed again, and this is the main thrust of the Scottish Government's argument, that it would be advisory, that there would not be legal implications if it were to come about. It's about asking the Scottish people their opinion on independence, that if they were to vote for it, and at the moment the polls, as we know, are split 50-50, as Darren was saying, if they were to vote for it, there would have to be further legislation. In effect, it would be just like the Brexit referendum in 2016, where the UK voted to leave the European Union, but there was then years of wrangling and legislation that had to be enacted to make that happen. So we'll hear more from Dorothy Bain this afternoon, probably outlining more so what the actual referendum would mean. She'll be stressing more that advisory aspect of it, and then tomorrow we'll hear from the UK government side of things.
Paul, for the moment, thanks very much. Back to you, of course, as that case progresses this afternoon. Thanks very much.
Now, a leading baby charity has exclusively told GB News that they're calling for mandatory third trimester scans for all mothers in a bid to prevent late loss and stillbirths.
That announcement comes during Baby Loss Awareness Week. The charity, called Abigail's Footsteps, has also marked the week by releasing a short film aimed at breaking the taboo surrounding baby loss. It's asking people just to say their baby's name.
Our reporter, Ellie Costello, went to meet a mother who lost her son, Jackson, in the late stages of pregnancy 2 years ago. She asked her how she remembers him.
I keep all these in my zip bags, so I don't want them to lose their smell.
Joanne Hanlon had a late miscarriage with her son, Jackson, in 2020. She was 6 months pregnant.
We actually struggled with fertility issues, so we was actually told that it would be a 1 in a million chance of us actually getting pregnant in the first place. So it was like a miracle baby. We was over the moon.
Joanne had to give birth to baby Jackson in hospital.
I guess you don't think about having to give birth to a baby who's not alive when you're pregnant. And it's a really difficult thing because part of you doesn't want to let them go. At the time, I just remember feeling like it was all my fault and I must have done something.
Well, estimates suggest that there are 250,000 miscarriages before 24 weeks in the UK each year. It's estimated that 1 in 5 pregnancies ends in miscarriage. Just over a year after Jackson's passing, Joanne gave birth to a happy and healthy baby boy, Theo.
This necklace has got one hoop for each child, and they've all got their birthstones on it, and that was a present for Christmas. And I like to do their handprints, and because one of the only things we've got of Jackson is his handprints and his footprints, so I like to do the kids' handprints and footprints so that he can still be included in things, because for us, he did exist.
Joanne says receiving counselling through a local charity, Abigail's Footsteps, helped her process her grief.
We lost Abigail back in 2009. She was 42 weeks gestation. The nursery was ready, the car seat was in the car. We were going to go into hospital, we were going to bring her home. And when we were told there was no heartbeat and, you know, we'd lost her, it was a tremendous shock.
Abigail's Footsteps charity are this week launching a new campaign for Baby Loss Awareness Week. It's called Say My Baby's Name.
Is this the room you were in before? Were you here with him?
It's okay. You can say my baby's name.
Were you here with Jordan?
Mum and Dad had that baby. That baby existed. Mum is a mum already. And please recognise that baby. Don't forget to say their name.
The charity is also calling for a mandatory third trimester scan for all mothers to try and prevent late loss and stillbirths.
And I'm hoping that we can push forward and make these things mandatory, that all mums can have a third scan and that we don't lose babies at 40, 41, 42 weeks as we did with Abigail. It shouldn't happen.
We put this suggestion to the Department of Health and Social Care. They said maternity safety is a priority and we are making progress to meet our target to halve the rates of stillbirth, neonatal and maternal deaths by 2025. We have invested £127 million into maternity services across the country. And the NHS has developed guidance for clinicians to reduce the risk of baby loss and better monitor pregnancies. Joanne hopes that by speaking about her son Jackson on Baby Loss Awareness Week, she can help other women feel like they can get the support they need too.
When you're going through that, it's really nice to have a support network around you that understands what you're going through, and being able to reach out to other people that have been through it has definitely helped me in my grieving process.
Ellie Costello, GB News.
A really moving report there from Ellie Costello.
Yes, and much more to mark Baby Loss Awareness Week, of course, and share your experiences perhaps with us as well on email. Now, let's tell you about the actor Kevin Spacey. He's due to appear in a court in New York shortly over accusations that he sexually abused an actor, Anthony Rapp, when he was just 14 years old.
The 63-year-old actor has categorically denied the accusations which were made following an incident that allegedly occurred in 1986. His alleged victim will be cross-examined today.
Well, Alice Porter, our correspondent, is joining us in the studio. This is actually a civil action rather than the criminal case at the moment.
Yes, that's right. Anthony Rapp is suing Kevin Spacey for $40 million. So whatever the outcome from this civil case, there will not be criminal charges brought against Kevin Spacey in this particular case. But as you were saying there, this all goes back to an alleged incident in 1986 when Anthony Rapp was just 14 years old, and he alleges that at Kevin Spacey's apartment in Manhattan that Kevin Spacey picked him up, put him on a bed, sort of lay on top of him, and Anthony Rapp said, "I was pinned underneath him, I didn't know what to do." Now, these claims were first made in 2017, and he was the first person, Anthony Rapp was the first person to make allegations against Kevin Spacey. And when the allegations sort of came to light, Kevin Spacey posted on Twitter saying, "I honestly don't remember this encounter, but if I did behave then as he describes, I owe him the sincerest apology." But Kevin Spacey's attorneys are now adamant the incident never happened and said an illegal filing that Rapp's allegations are quite simply false and never occurred. And last week we heard from lawyers in court for Kevin Spacey who argued that Anthony Rapp filed the suit because he's angry about his own stalled career.
How long will this case continue? How long before it's all comes to an end?
We've got a 2-week trial that's taking place in New York, but there are also other allegations that have been brought against Kevin Spacey, dozens in fact. And in July this year, Kevin Spacey appeared in London at the Old Bailey in relation...
And that's a criminal case.
That's a criminal case, and that's to deny 5 allegations of sexual assault by 3 men dating back 17 years, allegations he also completely denies. And they all relate to when Kevin Spacey was the artistic director of the Old Vic Theatre in London. And so that criminal case will take place in June of next year.
Right. Alice, thanks very much for updating us with all that. Thank you.
You are with GB Newsday with Mark Longhurst and Gloria De Piero. The Chancellor is due to speak to MPs, take questions from MPs in about half an hour as the pressure on him mounts from seemingly lots of quarters from his own side and from think tanks and the Bank of England following that mini-budget last month.
Yes, we'll have that live. And analysis too from Kevin Maguire and Andrew Pearce. Wonder what they'll be making of it. Anyway, let's get an update on the weather first.
Hello again, I'm Aidan McGivern from the Met Office. It was a chilly start for many in the south with a touch of frost in places. And it's a fine day for most, especially in the south where we keep the sunshine. But in the north, for Scotland and Northern Ireland, it's going to turn progressively more cloudy, more breezy. And there will be some rain later on ahead of these weather fronts that are moving in from the Atlantic. But high pressure across England and Wales brings mostly a fine day. The best of the sunny spells will be across East Anglia, the South Midlands, southern counties of England and South Wales. Further north, cloudier skies, 1 or 2 light showers for Cumbria into the Pennines. But more persistent rain will affect western Scotland along with a freshening breeze. And here, 12 or 13 Celsius will be the high in the afternoon, but further south, 15 or 16 Celsius possible where we get the sunny spells. But it's in the south and more especially the southeast where we keep the clear skies overnight. It will be once again a chilly night. But elsewhere, for much of the UK, thickening clouds and outbreaks of rain spilling into western Scotland, western parts of England, Wales and Northern Ireland. Some heavy bursts, mainly over western hills, but that will keep it mild. Temperatures staying in the double figures. A breezy night to come as well, with the strongest winds around the Western Isles. And then that rain pushes through the rest of Scotland into northern England, parts of Wales, and by lunchtime it's reaching Cornwall as well. But it does turn more showery by this stage. It clears Scotland and Northern Ireland, where sunny spells replaces the rain, and highs of 13 or 14 Celsius. And it stays bright in East Anglia in the southeast. After a chilly start here, 17 degrees is likely by the end of the day. Now, the front becomes slow-moving as it crosses central parts of the UK. Some heavy showers in places, particularly northern England, North Midlands, and then later on into much of Wales and the southwest. That front disappears, but more unsettled weather is on the way for Thursday and Friday. It's also going to turn much more windy.
Weekday afternoons on GB News, we've got the whole of the UK covered. From 12 to 3, it's GB Newsday with me, Mark Longhurst.
And me, Gloria De Piero. You'll get the very latest on everything that's been going on across our great nation.
And from 3 till 6, watch out for GB News Live with me, Patrick Christie's. I'm not here to mess around. With all the biggest topics and guests, you will always be up to date. GB Newsday and GB News Live from 12 p.m.
Only on GB News.
The People's Channel, Britain's news channel.
Hello there, it's Eamon Holmes here from Breakfast on GB News. We're not just on your television and your screens, you know.
We're on DAB plus digital radio, so you can listen to your favourite shows on the move.
If you've not yet listened to GB News Radio, it's very simple. We're on your radio player and tune-in apps, on your smart speaker, phone or tablet, or online at gbnews.uk.
Take us with you wherever you go. GB News Radio.
You never have to miss a moment of the People's Channel.
Join my show Farage, 7 p.m. till 8 p.m. Monday through Thursday. And there you will get opinion, analysis, debate, and I'll cover stories that nobody else dares to touch.
You've been cancelled. Join the club.
Oh my goodness me. And then for the last 15 minutes, talking pints. We're over a drink. We have a civilised conversation with someone. We very often disagree, but we do it in a grown-up way. Come and join me on Farage.
Hello, I'm Simon Evans. Join me on GB News for Headliners at 11 p.m, where I'll be joined by 2 of the country's top comedians as we take a look at tomorrow's newspapers tonight. If it's a big story, we'll be covering it, I guarantee, but we'll also have some fun along the way. That's GB News Headliners at 11 p.m. We won't put you to sleep, unlike some of the other paper review shows out there. So join us, 11 p.m, 7 nights a week.
A very good afternoon to you. Just 1 minute past 2. I'm Rosie Wright, keeping you up to date today on GB News. Now, number 10 say the Prime Minister remains committed to the measures that were set out in the mini-budget, despite further intervention today from the Bank of England. Well, the bank have bought more government debt, having warned again there's a risk to the UK's financial stability, and say they've acted to prevent dysfunction in the market. Initially forced to act to counter turmoil after the Chancellor's mini-budget, the bank's now expanding its bond buying in an effort, they say, to restore orderly market conditions. A leading economic think tank estimate the Chancellor has to cut £60 billion worth of spending if he wants to convince investors that he can get the public finances back under control. The Institute for Fiscal Studies say the shortfall is a consequence of measures announced since Liz Truss became Prime Minister. Well, the Chancellor, Kwasi Kwarteng, will appear in the Commons this afternoon and face questions from MPs about his plans. The Shadow Chief Secretary to the Treasury, Pat McFadden, told GB News the government's strategy is wrong.
What the government's going to do now is announce a whole series of public spending cuts in this Halloween fiscal event at the end of the month. And, you know, this doesn't make sense to make one set of mistakes and then compound it by making the public pay for ministers' mistakes through cuts in public services. It'd be far better to pause this whole thing and revisit the mistakes that caused the market chaos in the first place.
G7 leaders have met virtually to discuss the ongoing energy crisis and Russia's escalating missile attacks in Ukraine. Volodymyr Zelensky joined the Prime Minister Liz Truss and other heads of state early this afternoon for crisis talks. It's after Russia launched its most significant attack on the country in months. Missile strikes hit Kyiv and other cities, killing at least 19 people and injuring more than 100. Further air raid sirens have been heard this morning in the capital amid warnings of further Russian missile attacks. Ukrainian MP Alexei Goncharo told GB News President Putin's actions are an act of war.
All these wars against civilian areas, this was an act of terror. So Putin tries to threaten Ukrainians, but this will not happen. We are not afraid of Putin. We showed it to the whole world. And from this point of view, this was absolutely useless attack for Putin, but also it was a huge criminal crime, war crime from Russia.
The Scottish Government's told the Supreme Court it's in the public interest to resolve the issue of whether Holyrood can hold a second referendum on independence. Scotland's top law officer is putting forward the case for a second referendum without the support of Westminster. The First Minister, Nicola Sturgeon, says she wants to be able to hold an indisputably lawful vote. Well, 2 days have been set aside for the hearing. The UK government are expected to respond tomorrow. Unemployment in the UK has dropped to its lowest rate in over 50 years. Figures from the ONS said the rate fell to 3.5% over the 3 months to August. However, wages are failing to keep up with the rising cost of living. There's also been a record rise in the number of people off work or not looking for work because of long-term sickness. The first of the funerals for the victims of the service station explosion in County Donegal in Ireland are taking place today. A service for 24-year-old designer Jessica Gallagher is taking place at St Michael's Church. She's one of 10 people who were killed in a suspected gas explosion on Friday. Ireland's police force believe the blast was an accident and they're investigating the potential cause of the explosion. The government have said the Just Stop Oil protest that blocked some emergency vehicles this morning was unacceptable. A fire engine and an ambulance on blue lights were initially unable to get through until the demonstrators paused to let them pass. Campaigning for the UK government to stop using and developing fossil fuels, the group have caused disruption to major thoroughfares in central London over the last 11 days. You're now up to date on GB News. I'll bring you more as it happens. Now, back to Newsday.
Rosie, thanks very much indeed, and hello and welcome. Very warm welcome indeed to GB Newsday with me, Mark Longhurst.
And me, Gloria De Piero.
Now, in this hour, we're expecting to hear from the Chancellor, Kwasi Kwarteng, facing tough questions in the Commons about his handling of the economy and, of course, that mini-budget, crossing live to Westminster for that in about 20 minutes.
His appearance comes after the Bank of England made another dramatic intervention in the financial markets and warned of a serious risk to the UK's financial stability.
Well, we continue to discuss that warning from Britain's doctors too, that the health of the UK's population declining and that health inequalities are widening.
And the Scottish Government has launched an effort in the Supreme Court to hold a second independence referendum without Westminster's approval. Will the UK's top court rule in their favour?
And as ever, we want to hear from you at home and how you're getting on with the cost of living crisis. Please get in touch with us on all of today's stories, gbviews@gbnews.uk.
The Chancellor is due to face MPs in about 25 minutes' time after the Bank of England made a dramatic intervention to warn of material risk to financial stability.
Yes, the vital words that I missed there. Well, to add to Kwasi Kwarteng's problems, and ours, an influential think tank now warning that he needs to find another £62 billion or reverse those tax cuts to actually get the UK's finances back under control.
So how serious is it, and will the Chancellor be forced to do more U-turns? We're joined now by the economist Vicky Price from the Centre for Economics and Business Research. Tell us some good news about the economy, if you would, Vicky. I say that because the IMF have just issued some words. I don't know if you've got the chance to see them, but it's a mixed picture, according to the IMF, that Britain will be the fastest growing major economy this year, but that prices will be higher here than in other advanced nations.
I think that's quite likely to be the case. But of course, what they're also saying, and if you look at any forecast for 2023, we are likely to be one of the slowest growing countries. And that's a real worry. That is because inflation, indeed, as the IMF is saying, is more of an issue here and possibly more long term than many other countries. And we've also got a serious problem in relation to our public finances, which is really what's going on in the markets right now in terms of the Bank of England needing to intervene. But we've also got the positive news of unemployment coming down again. If we look at the 3 months, the latest 3 months data, which is down to August, and those are pretty good, really, because basically there is still a shortage of people. Many have left the labour market altogether. So there is still a search for talent. How long that will last is a question mark, because if we're going into a slowdown of the economy, which is what the forecasts are suggesting, unemployment tends to be a bit of a lagging indicator. In other words, you carry on employing people and recruiting for a while. But if you start looking now at the recruitment intentions across the country, with some exceptions like London, they are slowing down without any doubt, and redundancies are increasing. So unemployment is expected to start rising from here on.
Now, Vicky, you've been at the heart of government before in these times of crisis, but at this particular time, there does seem to be a disconnect, as you're saying, in terms of trust from the markets as to what is going on in the political direction. And, of course, the direct effect of that means that these gilt prices are going up, which means the government is having to borrow at a far higher rate.
Well, it will have to borrow at a higher rate because, of course, it has bonds right now which are priced at in a certain way, at a certain interest rate. So the question is really what happens to anything you borrow in the future, and also what happens to all those bonds that are index linked. And one of the reasons why the Bank of England, which is now stepping in to stop those yields from rising very significantly, is to do really with the concern that all those bonds which are in the market right now, including the index-linked ones, are going to be suffering in the future, and their prices, of course, falling and the yields going up to such an extent that the cost in the future for the government is going to be considerably greater. So we're not really looking at the cost, if you like, immediately, although that's gone up as well up to a point, is really what will happen later. Yeah. If you have that problem, then you've got a serious issue in terms of your fiscal position and what the markets may think continuously. Yeah. So you need
so given that Kwasi Kwarteng is actually in the Commons this afternoon with Treasury questions, how much wriggle room, how much room for manoeuvre does he have then?
Not huge, unfortunately. And we've already, of course, seen the U-turn on the 45p tax rate. He had said he was going to do more in the budget that was going to come originally in November. Now it's going to be at the end of October. Now, he may not do that, but one of the things that people were focusing on was whether he'd do something about the freezing of the allowances, income tax allowances, which of course are by themselves being frozen, bringing in a lot more taxes to the exchequer. So there is one positive thing for him there. So he could just not unfreeze them, for example. And he could look perhaps at some of their other issues. I don't think he can do anything much with the national insurance contributions, which of course are now going back to where they were more or less before the announcement and implementation by Rishi Sunak. But what he can do, and unfortunately it's going to be incredibly painful, as was suggested earlier, is to do something on public spending. But will the markets really believe that some of the public spending cuts, whatever they may be, when they're announced, and they could be indeed, pretty harsh on the National Health Service and lots of other services, can they in fact be implemented? So are they implementable?
Vicky,
if the markets don't think so, then they're not going to like it.
Vicky, just this morning, the Prime Minister's official spokesperson said there will be no austerity under Liz Truss. Does that mean that we won't see public spending cuts? It depends how you define austerity, I suppose.
Of course, I mean, what they're going to say is that there are loads and loads of efficiencies that can be made. We're not going to, go back to where we were under George Osborne, but what we'll do is we'll make sure that the money is properly spent. Well, you can't really achieve those efficiencies very easily at all. And of course, the cost now to the Bank of England of intervening again is quite significant, or will be. They haven't spent all the money they said they would. But it is an extraordinary situation. I think it is worth just bearing one thing in mind. Of course, yields have gone up everywhere. So whatever's happening here is affecting markets in other countries as well. There's been this huge increase over the last year in terms of what governments have to pay to fund continued growth, if you like, in their economy, or subsidise energy. But what happened here is the most extraordinary thing, which is that the day that the interest rates were increased, on one day before the mini budget, the Bank of England said it was going to sell quite a lot of the bonds it had acquired during COVID and before to the market, starting almost immediately. It had to reverse that completely within a few days. That just gives you an indication of the problems in the market that the Bank of England, being responsible for financial stability as well as just interest rates, has had to deal with.
Vicky Price from the Centre for Economics and Business Research. Thanks as ever.
Well, that's the economic picture. What about the political picture with the Chancellor due on his feet in, roughly about 15 minutes? Let's get more with our political correspondent, Tom Harwood, still at Westminster for us. Tom, I guess they'll be taking their seats for what could be a heavyweight contest with Rachel Reeves.
Certainly, Rachel Reeves really established herself at the Labour Party conference 2 weeks ago as someone who cares about fiscal responsibility. At least that's the impression she wanted to give. In a very well-received speech, she said that every measure would be fully funded. Now, some of the announcements that she made, funded by reversing tax cuts, was questionable, given that that wouldn't be new money. That would be the same level of money for new spending. But Labour did insist that they would, in the round, try and produce a balanced budget. Still questions to be asked, of course, but the messaging is fairly clear. This is someone who will scrutinise government spending and indeed government tax cuts too. It will be a fairly weighty ding-dong between the two, the Shadow Chancellor and indeed the Chancellor himself as well. And given how much the political fortune of this government has now been tied to its economic fortune, to the economic fortune of the country, this is a very, very interesting session to watch, and it will be crucial to see how the Chancellor will be able to respond to these questions of legitimate concerns within the markets, how the markets don't have all that much confidence that borrowing can be kept under control in the United Kingdom. Now, this all hinges, of course, on the government's plan to get growth up, to get to that 2.5% a year target of growth. Once they hit that magic number, a lot of the problems melt away because, of course, higher growth means higher tax receipts without having to raise taxes, and that means you can avoid some of those spending cuts that at the moment the Institute for Fiscal Studies say is necessary. 60 billion of spending cuts by 2027, they say. Well, if the Chancellor is able to get growth up, and no doubt this will be part of what he's saying in just a few minutes' time, if growth is able to be ticked up, that becomes less of an issue. But the issue for the government is that's a big if. we know the global factors are really worrying. The headwinds are strong. The energy crisis is global. The inflation crisis is global. And we don't know how much longer these will stretch on and how much of a knock global economics will provide for the United Kingdom's position. And that is a troubling assessment. However, of course, we are expecting on the 31st of this month now the Chancellor's medium-term fiscal plan. Number 10 say to us this isn't a budget, yet another non-budget, but a fiscal statement, this time talking about how the Chancellor intends to get these books balanced by the medium term, announcing his new fiscal rule, trying to steady markets with those clear guiding lines for fiscal policy. I wonder how many of the questions asked in just a few moments' time will be referred to that age-old phrase, you've got to wait for the fiscal statement. Maybe that might be a repeated refrain, but hopefully we will learn something from this very important session of questions, Treasury questions in the House of Commons in just a few moments' time.
And we'll bring them to our viewers and listeners live. Tom Howard, thank you for the preview.
Now, Britain's doctors warning that the health of the UK's population declining, health inequalities widening.
In a report published today, the British Medical Association has found a lower life expectancy as a result of the decline in the population's health. It found that since 2014, life expectancy has more or less flatlined at around 79.2 years for men and 82.9 for women.
Well, of course, in 2020, the impact of COVID-19 leading to a further decline in life expectancy, indeed a sharp reversal of previous trends where we were starting to live longer.
Joined now by the former BMA president, Professor Nina Modi, whose project on human health and well-being is the basis of the report. Nina, it's great to see you. I suppose we've always assumed that life expectancy, that the age that we live till, would just continue to go up and up. Was that a false assumption? What evidence did we have to base that sort of premise?
Not at all. I mean, as you said a moment ago in your opening statements, the life expectancy in the UK had been going up steadily, but it started to flatten off before COVID. And Britain has now got the lowest life expectancy of all European countries, which is not a good position to be in. And there are other indicators that show us very clearly that Britain is getting progressively more unhealthy. Now, this isn't just a disaster for the individuals concerned and for their families and for their children, but it's also economic suicide because, again, I think you reported earlier today that the number of adults who are not working because they are unwell or they have a chronic condition, it has reached its highest level ever. So taken together, this is more bad news for the Chancellor. We have got an unhealthy population and a deteriorating workforce.
And unhealthy in what way? Because we clearly got a handle on smoking, for instance, which led to this decline then in cancer, particularly lung cancer. But are we talking now about dietary problems, lots of salt and fat and sugar and processed foods and so on?
Well, there are a number of different indicators, but let me give you some of them. So, for example, 2 out of 3 adults in Britain is now overweight or obese. And if you're overweight or obese, it's substantially increases your risk, your likelihood of getting, for example, diabetes. And we know also that the number of adults with diabetes in the population has doubled in recent years. So we are on a very bad trajectory. Then if you think about children, obesity rates in children are also going up. And 4 out of 5 obese children will remain obese as adults with all that brings. They will be more likely to die of cardiovascular disease, more likely to get diabetes and so on and so forth. Also, perhaps more immediately, 25% of our school children have got rotten teeth. Now, this is entirely preventable, and yet many of them need to have a general anaesthetic in order to have their teeth extracted. It is just terrible because it is totally preventable. And as I said earlier, we have got the lowest life expectancy in all of Europe. We've also got one of the highest rates of musculoskeletal problems. I could go on, but you get...
Nina, just let me just come in for a final brief one, if you would. How does being rich or poor define your life expectancy and whether you live in good health?
Hugely. And so, for example, if you're poor, let's take a woman from the poorest area of Britain, has got, this is a shocking figure, so prepare yourself, is going to live at least 14, has got a life expectancy that is 14 years less than a woman living in the most affluent areas. And if you look at the figures for healthy life expectancy, so living in good health, those figures are even bigger. So how poor you are absolutely, materially, significantly, substantially affects your life chances and your health throughout life.
Professor Nina Modi, really interesting to talk to you. I hope we get to talk to you again on the show soon. Thank you for your time today.
Thank you very much. Thank you.
Well, coming up, the Chancellor due to face those questions in the Commons. The Bank of England issuing a grim warning. Another warning from the IMF. It's all happening out there. Andrew Pearce and John Rentoul joining us ahead to give their verdict.
Before that, it's time for your weather.
Weekday afternoons on GB News, we've got the whole of the UK covered. From 12 to 3, it's GB Newsday with me, Mark Longhurst.
And me, Gloria De Piero. You'll get the very latest on everything that's been going on across our great nation.
And from 3 till 6, watch out for GB News Live with me, Patrick Christie. I'm not here to mess around with all the biggest topics and guests. You will always be up to date. GB Newsday and GB News Live from 12 p.m.
Only on GB News.
The People's Channel, Britain's news channel.
Hello there, it's Eamon Holmes here from Breakfast on GB News. We're not just on your television and your screens, you know.
We're on DAB plus digital radio, so you can listen to your favourite shows on the move.
If you've not yet listened to GB News Radio, it's very simple. We're on your radio player and tune-in apps, on your smart speaker, phone or tablet, or online at gbnews.uk.
Take us with you wherever you go. GB News Radio.
You never have to miss a moment of the People's Channel.
Join my show Farage, 7 p.m. till 8 p.m. Monday through Thursday. And there you will get opinion, analysis, debate, and I'll cover stories that nobody else dares to touch.
You've been cancelled. Join the club.
Oh my goodness me. And then for the last 15 minutes, talking pints. We're over a drink. We have a civilised conversation with someone. We very often disagree, but we do it in a grown-up way. Come and join me on Farage.
Hello, I'm Simon Evans. Join me on GB News for Headliners at 11 p.m, where I'll be joined by two of the country's top comedians as we take a look at tomorrow's newspapers tonight. If it's a big story, we'll be covering it, I guarantee, but we'll also have some fun along the way. That's GB News Headliners at 11 p.m. We won't put you to sleep, unlike some of the other paper review shows out there. So join us, 11 p.m, 7 nights a week.
Welcome back. We're just minutes away from hearing from the Chancellor in the House of Commons. He'll take questions from MPs on the government's economic strategy.
And maybe get a battering from the shadow Chancellor Rachel Reeves as well. Well, the last time Kwasi Kwarteng spoke in the Commons was when he revealed that mini-budget last month with the maxi impact, of course, followed by major economic instability and a dire warning from the Bank of England this morning once more that it could all still lead to a crisis unless the government takes appropriate action. Let me just actually update you on a bit more we're getting from the IMF, which basically is saying that the tax package is expected to lift growth. However, it's complicating the fight against inflation. That's the latest assessment from Washington.
And that's prices, of course. We're joined by Andrew Pearce, consultant editor for the Daily Mail and soon-to-be colleague, and John Rentoul, chief political commentator at The Independent. Gentlemen, Parliament hasn't sat for so long, and of course the last time we saw the Chancellor in the House, he was feeling pretty pleased with himself when he delivered that budget. It may or may not be a different Chancellor we see today. Just tell us, Andrew, starting with you, tell us about the Chancellor's mood as he faces MPs for the first time since that budget.
Well, look, he was very, very upbeat, wasn't he, when he delivered that budget? It got pretty good. It got some pretty good coverage at the time, but of course it unravelled very quickly. It caused a major problem on the international markets. He made a very, very shaky, uncertain speech at the Tory party conference. In fact, it was a dreadful speech, in my view. So he's battered. There's a lot of speculation as to whether he's going to keep his job. Is he going to be the shortest serving Chancellor in history? There's a lot of speculation, of course, as to whether Liz Truss keeps her job too. But he will point to this IMF survey that's come out. Depending on which way you look at it, The Guardian saying it's a bad survey because it talks about the threat to inflation caused by the Chancellor's measures. But if you read the Daily Telegraph, they say the measures, according to the IMF, are going to help Britain to be the fastest growing major economy this year. Just depends which way you look. But he's got a lot of convincing to do. He's not just got to convince those Tory MPs. He's got to convince the markets he's in control and in charge and got a grip on policy. And in the last few weeks, it hasn't really looked like that.
Yeah, and John, the other problem, of course, he's facing a heavyweight across the floor of the House of Commons in Rachel Reeves, who's got Treasury experience. And it does seem that Treasury orthodoxy, surprise, surprise, is coming back to bite him.
Yes, I think he's going to have to adjust his tone from 18 days ago when he actually delivered that mini budget. There was an arrogance about it that offended MPs on his own side, let alone MPs on the other side. I think he's going to have to be a bit more humble. And as Andrew said, he's going to have to have a view to the markets outside the chamber, because their verdict will be just as important as anything that happens inside the House of Commons.
And the country might not really know Rachel Reeves that well. I'll ask you this question, John. Just tell us a bit about the woman who wants to be our Chancellor and her style and her key message.
Well, she's quite a tough customer, and she is a former Bank of England economist herself, so she knows what she's talking about. Labour have a problem, though, because they actually support two of the big tax cuts, the basic rate tax cut and the national insurance cut. So they can't, and she's calling for a reversal of the entire mini budget. So I'm not quite sure how she squares that, but I think it's Kwasi Kwarteng who's going to have the most difficult job in a few minutes.
Andrew, the other sort of part of this political landscape was that we were told Liz Truss was on this charm offensive. She was going to go around the tea rooms and speak to MPs. As someone said, sticky buns to get out of a sticky situation. Do we know how that's gone?
Well, it's bizarre, isn't it? I mean, what new Prime Minister? Most new Prime Ministers have a honeymoon period. This is a nightmare start for the Prime Minister. She's calling MPs into Downing Street for tea and coffee, lunches. She was doing the tea rooms this morning, I gather. I don't know how it's gone, but we will get reports back. But this is a sign that they realise they've got to take their MPs with them. Nobody in the Cabinet, for instance, knew, apart from the Chancellor, that they were going to cut the top rate of tax from 45p to 40p for people earning more, £150,000 or more. And you tend to think if other cabinet ministers had been in the loop, they may have raised the red flag and said, "You sure, Prime Minister? You sure, Chancellor? You really think that's a good idea during a cost of living and energy crisis?" Because it was political lunacy, in my view. You can make a case for cutting the top rate of tax, an economic case for that, but not now. The politics of it are terrible, and the optic looked awful.
John, we saw over the weekend lots of her allies, lots of people in the Cabinet writing articles in newspapers, pleading for unity. I mean, in a sense, isn't that a sign of weakness? You don't make a plea for unity from a position of strength, do you?
No, absolutely. I mean, that's interesting. William Hague is writing for the papers this morning, saying that one of his rules was never to appeal for party unity, because as soon as you do that, you're at the mercy of the next Tory backbencher who wants to make a name for themselves by disagreeing with the leader. So yes, all these calls for party unity are a sign of weakness. And I think there's a very fundamental weakness. I mean, Andrew's quite right. The top rate tax cut was a presentational disaster, not a huge amount of money, but a presentational disaster. But it drew attention to the fact that the underlying sums don't add up, and the tax cuts on top of borrowing for the energy package has really unsettled the markets. And as we can see today, that market turmoil is carrying on, and I'm not sure that Kwasi Kwarteng can do anything about it, because he can't cut spending. He can't offer to cut spending by a significant amount because the House of Commons won't agree to it, and he can't put up taxes either. So they are really trapped.
And Andrew, clearly the Westminster Village has been awash with rumours about letters going into Sir Graham Brady, the 1922 committee already, suggestions there may even be 20 letters in his postbox. But is part of the problem that Kwasi Kwarteng and Liz Truss stand or fall together? If she goes, he goes. If he goes, she goes.
I think there's something in that, Mark, because it's their policy. It was their fiscal statement, mini budget, call it what you will. And as I say, and they didn't take anybody else into the loop. As for these letters, I suspect letters went into Sir Graham Brady, the chairman of the 1922, within an hour of Liz Truss being declared leader of the Tory party, because a lot of Tory MPs didn't vote for her, didn't want her, and still don't want her. And they will almost certainly letters have gone in since the markets took fright at the financial package. But the rules currently mean there can be no leadership challenge within for another year. But of course, rules can be changed. And Tory MPs, unlike Labour, who have put up with useless, failing leaders, are ruthless about getting rid of leaders who they think might possibly cost them their job.
Andrew, I'm going to stick with you because I wanted to see if you agreed with a point that John Rentoul made in an earlier remark, saying that when it comes to getting the public finances under control, she can't raise taxes and she can't cut spending because she doesn't have the numbers in Parliament to do either of those. So the government is effectively trapped. I thought it was a very interesting premise put forward by John Rentoul. Is he right, in your view?
I think that it is a real problem because the numbers clearly don't add up, at least according to the city. And I think her instinct is to cut public spending. I mean, we think what she wanted to do was only uprate benefits in line with average earnings, which is 5%, maybe 6%. But actually, she's not going to get that through the Cabinet. The Cabinet are insisting that she raises benefits in line with inflation, which is nearer 10%. So that's another huge potential saving out of the window. So I don't know what she's going to do. Is she really going to borrow even more? Markets won't like that.
Part of this, John, is that for Rachel Reeves, she's got a bit of an easy target at the moment, but she clearly will have a problem if she comes in as a Chancellor with any new Labour administration in trying to get growth going in the economy, which is the whole idea of this Kwasi Kwarteng project, i.e. that you cut the taxes and that maybe Labour Party office on the line to you to give the line. I don't know. However, suggestions, of course, that, you've got to cut taxes in some way to get this growth going in the economy.
Well, yeah, but I mean, I think there's no real evidence that cutting taxes automatically produces higher growth. But you're right that Labour do have a problem because the sums don't add up in such a, the gap between revenue and spending is so large that even if all the tax cuts were reversed, it wouldn't be enough to bridge the gap, according to the Institute for Fiscal Studies. So Labour have got a problem too. But Rachel Reeves does always have the fact that she supports an extended...
Gentlemen, we are going to take our viewers and listeners live to the House of Commons. Thank you for your insights. We're going to see the joust.
Many of his constituents will appreciate the strong measures that we introduced.
Excellent. I was being slightly...
Mr. Speaker, I refer members to my entries in the Register of Interest. In welcoming the government's growth agenda, notwithstanding the lack of reassurance to the markets, will the Chancellor seriously consider lowering taxation on smaller businesses, despite the package that's already been announced, because they are the engine room of the economy. They do employ most people in the private sector, and if cost savings are necessary, HS2 and the streamlining of a myriad of quangos could be the first option.
Well, of course, I'm very pleased to tell my honourable friend that we're going to introduce a medium-term fiscal plan in 3 weeks. But consider the measures we've already introduced. National insurance hikes have been reversed, corporation tax rise has been scrapped, and the annual investment allowance remains at £1 million. These are measures which small businesses up and down the land have been very, very appreciative of.
Ian Levy. Thank you, Mr. Speaker. As my right honourable friend will be aware, small businesses are the backbone of our local economy. And none know more than Caitlin Bakery in Cramlington, and they've expanded from running a bakery to running a cafe and now a dessert bar. So would my right honourable friend please assure me that this government will do all we can to help these businesses thrive?
Absolutely right. And of course, in relation to the bakery that he mentions, Catling Bakery, we've also supported them through an energy package. £60 billion for households and businesses for 6 months, and that's something that we absolutely felt necessary to do.
Scott McCartney.
Thank you, Speaker. It's like I never went away, and I refer members and colleagues to my entry in the Register of Interest. Supporting businesses will always be a key pillar for growing our economy, and by association, our small and medium-sized businesses, which there are many of in Lincoln and more across our county of Lincolnshire. They should be at the forefront of the government's growth agenda. Devolved areas such as Teesside and West Midlands have continually been successful in delivering for their areas. Greater Lincolnshire stands ready right now for a maximum devolution deal. Therefore, will the Treasury support any such deal for Greater Lincolnshire?
My honourable friend knows, Mr. Speaker, that devolution is at the heart of the government's plans to level up and strengthen communities. And of course, in the Levelling Up White Paper, the government has fully committed to offering a devolution deal to every area that wants one by 2030.
Sherman.
You won't be around then.
Mr. Speaker, can I declare an interest to the Chancellor? I've actually worked in a small and medium business. I've actually, unlike many people on these benches, worked in manufacturing industry. And the manufacturing SMEs in my constituency are absolutely up against it in terms of the cost of energy. What is he going to do to relieve them right now?
I think the honourable gentleman makes a very good point and represents his constituency ably. In respect of small businesses, we have introduced a package, an energy price guarantee, not only for households but for businesses, which is to the tune of £30 billion in the first 6 months. This was something that was absolutely necessary, and I'm very proud of the fact that we acted very swiftly to protect businesses like those in his constituency.
Sarah Owen.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. The government's failed mini-budget has sent interest rates soaring, which is already causing mortgage pain for millions. But rising borrowing costs are now threatening our high streets too. Small businesses in Richmond Park and across the UK are seeing their loan repayments spiral and their financing options dry up. We've already seen the highest company insolvencies since the financial crisis. More than 5,600 businesses have closed in the second quarter of this year, and SME debt is now at a staggering £204 billion. Most of these businesses won't see a penny from the cut to corporation tax. What is the Chancellor...
Order. Chancellor, come on.
Thank you. As I've stated a number of times already, the energy package, the energy support package, will help every single one of the businesses in her constituency. And I'd be very pleased to see the Lib Dem growth plan. The anti-growth coalition carbs from the sidelines, but it has nothing to say about growth.
Chris Brown.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The one thing that businesses always want is security and understanding of what's going to happen for them next year. They're worrying about mortgage, their borrowing costs for next year. The Chancellor has already made that more difficult for them. He says that he's got a package for energy costs, but it only lasts for 6 months. A leisure company, I spoke to the man who owns a leisure company that I was speaking to yesterday, said that his bill next year will be going from £100,000 to £475,000. He will be closing. Why doesn't he bring in a proper measure that's going to last more than 6 months?
So I think the honourable gentleman makes a fair point in respect to energy costs. And that is precisely why we intervened in the way that that my right honourable friend, the Prime Minister, announced only a couple of weeks ago. The package is £60 billion for households and businesses across the next 6 months. And that is a generous package, and we are listening.
SNP spokesperson Alison Poulos.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Businesses of all sizes are struggling with Brexit, import costs, material costs, the weak pound against the dollar and the euro, increased wage and energy costs. And they still don't know what will happen when the Chancellor's temporary reprieve ends in March. The clock is ticking. Calder Millerfield, a food manufacturing business in my constituency, have come back to me with their latest quote, with relief applied, £944,000 per year, up from £160,000 last year. What was the Chancellor going to do to support manufacturing businesses now, because they will not survive with these increases?
Yeah. Chancellor. As I've stated, the energy price guarantee does help in a large measure businesses. And also, I'm not, Mr. Speaker, going to take lectures from the SNP about growth. I mean, in Scotland, for every year from 2010 to 2019, the growth was lower than for the rest of the United Kingdom. I'm not going to take any lessons about supporting business from the Honourable Lady.
Boris Robertson.
Question number 3, Mr. Speaker.
Minister.
Mr. Speaker, the Chancellor speaks regularly to the Governor of the Bank of England on a wide range of matters. As my honourable friend knows, the Bank of England sets monetary policy, including interest rates, independently of government.
Boris Robertson.
I thank the Minister for that response. Obviously, the world situation is the biggest cause of the rise in interest rates, but that is having a detrimental effect on mortgage payers, of course, and it risks negativising the very welcome help that the government has provided through energy costs and tax cuts. Can the Chancellor and the Ministers meet more regularly with the Bank of England to coordinate policy a little more closely?
Minister.
I thank my honourable friend for his question. He's a passionate advocate in this place for his constituents. The Chancellor and myself meet regularly with the Bank of England and with all of the individual lending banks in the UK. My honourable friend knows that interest rates have increased in every major economy, despite what the opposition may claim to say, and that's why it's so important that we're providing help with energy and cutting taxes.
Dame Angela Riedel.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker, but surely ministers must now, first of all, apologise for the chaos. The mini-budget, with its £45 billion of unfunded spending commitments in tax cuts, has caused to the bond markets. And isn't it now a fact that there is a Tory premium on every interest rate rise for every borough in this country, and they're not going to forget it when the election comes?
Mr. Speaker, I think we understand there's a very clear divide in this House between our side, which is supporting growth, which is providing support for energy bills, giving the economy the confidence and certainty that it needs this winter, and bringing forward supply-side measures that's going to boost the economy, not be on the side of striking workers, bringing this economy to a halt.
Shadow Minister Pat McFadden.
Thank you. With your permission, Mr. Speaker, I'd like to send my condolences to the families of all those killed in the tragic accident in Creeslough, County Donegal last week. My parents came from quite nearby. It's a beautiful place with a close community, and they're very much in our prayers right now. I'd also like to welcome the Minister to his position. I'm sure that he and the Chancellor's team wanted our first budget to be remembered, perhaps even studied in years to come. Well, Mr. Speaker, they've certainly achieved that ambition. 2-year fixed mortgage rates are above 6% for the first time since 2008, and they've risen sharply since the Chancellor's mini-budget. Everyone coming off such a rate will face much higher payments over the coming year, possibly hundreds of pounds a month more. Why should people who've worked hard to buy their own home pay the price for the government's mistakes?
Mr. Speaker, I'd like to add my comments and thoughts to the incident in County Down last week. We talked, Mr. Speaker, already about our comprehensive energy support package that helps not just every household this winter, preventing them from the uncertainty of energy bills that were potentially forecast to reach £6,500 per home, but also businesses. And this is the government that is on the support side of businesses that's keen to improve the supply side of our economy so that we can grow to create the tax revenues for our high-quality public services.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. This morning, the Bank of England made a further intervention in the markets, warning of, and I quote, a material risk to UK financial stability. This risk comes directly from the Chancellor's mini-budget 2.5 weeks ago. How much more will government borrowing cost next year as a result of the rise in gilt yields since the Chancellor's statement on September 23rd?
Mr. Speaker, as I've already observed, we're seeing interest rates rise in every major Western economy. Perhaps the opposition front benches, when they're finished with their British exceptionalism, will actually lift their eyes and notice that. What's more important is that we are protecting consumers and households through the difficult winter months ahead. We're cutting taxes, measures that this side of the House supports and that side of the House opposes.
SNP spokesperson Alison Poulos.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. The IMF observed today that the Chancellor's unfunded tax cuts have complicated the fight against inflation. As a result, the Bank of England is expected to increase the base rate to levels not seen since 2008. Families have already struggled with increasing energy prices, and Kantar say that grocery inflation stands at 13.9%. Santander are preparing for increased mortgage defaults. So can I ask the Minister, what are he and his Treasury team doing to tackle this absolute chaos they have created themselves?
Minister.
Mr. Speaker, I understand that it's absolutely inimical to the Nationalist Party to talk this country down at every opportunity. The reality is that we are taking the action that we need. We are tackling supply side, we are tackling the strikes that are grinding down the economy, and we are building the energy that we need that will help strengthen our economy and strengthen our currency. Her party oppose nuclear and they oppose more oil and gas exploration.
Sir. Minister.
Mr. Speaker, with permission, I'd like to group this with question number 11. A critical part of the government's growth plan is road, rail and energy infrastructure, and we will be introducing legislation very shortly to make sure the delivery of that critical infrastructure is massively sped up.
Thank you. I'm grateful for the investment in physical infrastructure, but the Treasury front bench will know that infrastructure needs skills. We need the skills for the future, to deliver the jobs for the future, to make the infrastructure investment sustainable. So will the Minister meet with me to discuss the idea for MKU, a brand new university in Milton Keynes? Every single Minister and Secretary of State that I've spoken to about this thinks it's a good idea. Will he meet with me and get it off paper and get boots on the ground?
Minister.
Well, I thank my honourable friend, the member for Milton Keynes North, who is a tireless champion for the great place, or the great town of Milton Keynes. I would be delighted to meet with him to discuss this idea, along with colleagues perhaps from the Department for Education. I note, of course, that Milton Keynes has already received £23 million through the Towns Fund, but I'm very happy to meet with him to discuss this idea.
John Stevenson.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Growing the economy is about improving people's lives, but also improving the success of places like Carlisle. To achieve this, we need investment, both public and private. In the case of public investment, it is an infrastructure that will make the real difference. Given the rise in the cost of such infrastructure projects, can the Chancellor or the Minister confirm that where these projects have a shortfall in funding but are ready to go, that the government will step in and give additional funding?
Well, it is very much our intention to speed up projects where they are ready to go. The growth plan announced a few weeks ago made very clear our commitment to doing that. The last spending review provided, I think, about £100 billion of funding towards critical economic infrastructure. But where we can speed projects up, we will certainly be doing that. And I think one of the projects that we have in mind to do exactly that for is the A66 North Transpennine route, which I believe goes not far from the honourable gentleman's constituency.
Nick Smith.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. In 2017, former Conservative Energy Minister Charles Hendry conducted a review into the Swansea Bay tidal lagoon. He gave it the thumbs up, but since then successive governments haven't pursued it. Now, given the energy crisis we're in, will the Minister consider reopening the business case? It could be a fantastic source of green energy for our country.
Well, the government is extremely interested in all forms of new energy generation. We're determined to make sure that the United Kingdom is electricity independent. There are all kinds of projects we're looking at, including, of course, marine projects. I understand that when the Swansea scheme was previously investigated, there were questions about value for money, but I'm sure any proposition that is put forward, and if the honourable gentleman wants to do it, we'd be very happy to take a careful look at it.
Stephen Flynn. When it comes to the delivery of project, we can't help but admire the speed at which the government has managed to transform Downing Street from a nightclub into a casino. But I have one ask that isn't a gamble. The Acorn project in the northeast of Scotland. When are they going to deliver it?
Well, my honourable friend, the Chancellor, says that that is something we are examining very carefully. But let me say, his characterisation of the growth plan, I think, is extremely unfair. The real risk, I would say that the real risk is in not having a growth plan. The real risk is in having taxes that are too high. The real risk is not investing in infrastructure. What is clear is that this government has a growth plan. The opposition has no plan.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. And of course, it's always right to look for efficiencies and try and get better value money for the taxpayer. As we look for spending cuts, could my right honourable friend confirm that those spending cuts will not come at the expense of reductions of vital infrastructure spending in our regions, not least in the north of England?
Minister. Yeah, well, look, I'm pleased to say, as the Chancellor said when he introduced the growth plan, that expediting critical infrastructure is an important part of that plan. Without critical infrastructure, we're not going to see the growth in jobs, the growth in wages, and the prosperity that we all want to see. And this government will do everything it can to speed up the delivery of those projects.
Clive Betts. Thank you, Mr. Speaker. We don't know much yet about the government's new investment zones, but in order to achieve the success of the private investment in them, will the government have specifically targeted funds for infrastructure projects in those zones? And if so, will this be a further unfunded expenditure commitment?
Well, I think the Chancellor set out the investment zone concept very clearly. There would be, by agreement with local authorities, planning freedoms and also very significant tax cuts. Infrastructure investments are being handled separately to that, but I think it would be reasonable to expect a degree of coordination between DLUC and the Department of Transport as they consider the way that investment zones interact with transport projects.
Why should it call over?
5, Mr. Speaker.
Minister.
Mr. Speaker, reforming the EU's directive on bonus cap is not about paying people more. All it ever did was increase base pay regardless of performance. It was never a cap on total remuneration, and no one should pretend that it was.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. That was total nonsense. But as some families in Battersea struggle to keep up with the rising cost of living, this government has chosen to help bankers by removing the cap on their bonuses whilst maintaining the cap on household social security. Shame. Now, despite soaring bills and growing inflation, the cap has remained stagnant since 2016, plunging hundreds of thousands of families into deep poverty. The cap on social security is cruel, and how can the Chancellor seriously justify removing the cap on bankers' bonuses but not on the social security cap? So will he have a word with his colleagues at the Work and Pensions Department and change that?
Mr. Speaker, the Honourable Lady's fully booked her place as a member of the Anti-Growth Coalition. In 1970, this government is not afraid to be on the side of the people that create the wealth that funds our public services. In 1979, the top 1% of earners paid about 10% of income tax. They now pay 29.1%. That's 3 times as much.
Your friend agree with me that scrapping the cap on bankers' bonuses will not only increase competitiveness but also increase tax receipts as well, Mr. Speaker?
Yes.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. At a time when my constituents are struggling to make ends meet, they're struggling to put food on the table and struggling to put the heating on, this government has decided the way to increase growth in the economy is to lift the cap on bankers' bonuses. As Shadow City Minister, not a single person that I spoke to in the city or a single bank that I spoke to said this was the right policy to drive growth in the economy. So could I ask the Minister, does he really think this policy will drive growth in the economy, or are we going to see yet another U-turn from his government?
Minister.
I can assure the honourable lady that this government is going to grow the economy, and it's going to grow the economy by releasing the burden, the yoke of taxation, whether that's on ordinary people, cutting the basic rate of tax from 20 pence to 19 pence, whether it's today by reversing the increase in national insurance, or by cutting the taxes on the businesses that she's been meeting, and I welcome that, by reversing the increase in corporation tax next year.
Mr. Speaker.
This government will back first-time buyers by increasing the level at which they start paying stamp duty. Young couple can now purchase a property for up to $425,000 without paying tax.
Mr. Speaker, it's a core tenet of our belief to help everyone onto the housing ladder. So can I ask the Minister, what assessment has he made since the growth plan about helping people and areas build houses for those who need it and want it?
Minister. My honourable friend, the Secretary of State for Department of Housing Local Government will be making a statement to this House in the coming weeks.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. My constituent wrote to me, said, what world do the Tories live in? I guess one where you protect the rich and wealthy. The suggestion that the Treasury thinks that a person on 30k a year can buy a home in London is frankly laughable and salt in the wound. Can I please ask the Minister how he expects my constituents in Vauxhall, who are already struggling to pay their rent, to save on a salary of 30k to buy a new home?
Minister. I'd be very happy to write to the honourable lady to talk to her constituents about the unprecedented intervention that we have made to protect her constituents this winter from their energy bills, putting valuable certainty and confidence not just into every household but into every business in the economy, which is why today the IMF have increased their growth forecast for the United Kingdom.
Number 7, Mr. Speaker.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. In relation to his question, he will have seen that I brought forward the publication of the medium-term fiscal plan to the 31st of October.
Mr. Speaker, I think the House will agree with me that the uncertainty over the state hasn't exactly helped forward planning when it came to benefits. Any real cut in benefits will mean people not having enough money to buy food and buy clothing for their children. So does the Chancellor agree with me that increasing benefits in line with inflation is the only fair way forward? Indeed, it would be immoral to do otherwise. And as the Chief Executive Inverness Citizens Advice Bureau has pointed out to me, such benefit money is spent locally, within the local economy, and is a boost to what the Chancellor has talked about many times, which is growing the economy.
Well, I'm delighted to see that one member of the anti-growth coalition is focusing on growth. But in relation to his specific question, he will understand that the medium-term fiscal plan is coming out on the 31st of October, and I'm not going to prejudge any measures in it.
Robert Halford. Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Does my honourable friend agree that a very important part of the plan for growth is the levelling up fund, and has my honourable friend seen Harlow Council's levelling up fund bid, which I wholeheartedly support, which would transform a derelict area of our town centre into a thriving cultural quarter with jobs, investment and tackling antisocial behaviour, with these abandoned buildings which are far too long blighted the heart of our town?
I know that my right honourable friend is a redoubtable and highly persuasive representative of his constituents, and I'd be very happy to talk to him about what we can do together to help his great constituency.
Thank you,
Mr. Speaker. The Bank of England has had to intervene not once, not twice, but 3 times now. And the impact on pension funds is obviously very, very significant. Many of my constituents are going to be deeply worried. What assessment has the Chancellor made of the impacts on potential additional pressures on the economy in the future on public sector pension pay because of the damage to pension funds for pensioners up and down this country? Is that another reason why he didn't want to publish the OBR at the time of his mini-budget?
So the OBR will be fully scoring and giving a forecast ahead of the medium-term fiscal plan. In relation to the Bank of England, I speak to the Governor very frequently, and he is someone who is absolutely independent and is actually managing what is a global situation very effectively.
Chair of the Select Committee, Bell Stride.
Mr. Speaker, I very much welcome my right honourable friend's decision to bring forward the medium-term plan and the OBR forecast. He has listened and he is right. But could I caution him that when it comes to the measures that he puts forward to underpin that forecast, that he reaches out as much as he can across this side of the House and the other side of the House to be absolutely certain that he can get those measures through this House. Any failure to do so will unsettle the markets.
My right honourable friend is absolutely right. He does a brilliant job chairing his committee and is full of wise counsel. And he's absolutely right that we will and should canvass opinion widely ahead of the publication of the plan.
Alison McGovern.
Mr. Speaker, the OBR was the creation of a Conservative government designed to curtail wishful thinking in economic policy. So does the Chancellor agree with me that it's unfortunate, to say the least, that we seem to have Cabinet Ministers briefing against the economic expertise of that independent institution?
Chancellor, as far as I'm concerned, and I speak to investors regularly about this, the OBR is an institution that commands wide respect, not only in the UK, but across the world, and its independence, to me, is absolutely sacrosanct.
Gail Perman.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The energy price guarantee is an outstanding part of the growth plan and key, but far too few businesses and households know about it. Can I urge the Chancellor to have a nationwide mail-out campaign coupled to government taking the lead on the reduction of energy in all public buildings, as the Germans and other countries are doing so? This has the twin benefit of saving consumers and also reducing taxpayer subsidy.
I think my honourable friend makes an excellent suggestion. Obviously, I'm very careful not to make unfunded spending commitments on the floor of the House. But his suggestion is a very well-made one, which we should look into.
Shadow Minister James Money.
Mr. Speaker, the Chancellor's refusal to publish OBR forecasts just over 2 weeks ago played a key role in falling confidence in the pound, rising borrowing costs and market panic. His woeful decision to avoid scrutiny by gagging the OBR helped increase mortgage costs for working people who are now paying the price for Conservative failure. The Chancellor's behaviour has been described by the former Bank of England Governor Mark Carney as undercutting economic institutions, and Jonathan Haskell, a member of the Monetary Policy Committee, made clear that a sidelined OBR generates more uncertainty. Does the Chancellor accept they are right?
As I've repeatedly said in this session, the OBR will have a fully forecasted and scored response to the medium-term fiscal plan in less than 3 weeks.
George Freeman.
Question 8, Mr. Speaker.
Minister.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. At the 2021 spending review, the government announced an increase in public expenditure on R&D to £20 billion per year by 2024-25, including funding for association to EU programmes.
George Freeman.
The Chancellor and his team for making the Treasury a growth department, and would they agree with me that innovation-led growth is particularly important if we want to drive up productivity, competitiveness and inward investment, that our high-growth sectors like space, agri-tech and fusion have a big role to play? And would the Minister specifically reassure those in the R&D community that he won't be tempted to reduce the allocation for Horizon or for science and research in the CSR in order to reassure the markets?
Mr. Speaker, very few members of this House can look back on a track record of commitment to research and development as significant as my honourable friend, both as a minister and as backbencher, and so I am happy to confirm to him that we will abide by the Spending Review 2021 decision. That includes funding for core Innovate UK programmes, for Association Horizon Europe and for ARIA.
But the Minister needs to be much more specific about the Horizon Europe programme. Is he aware of what the Nobel laureate Sir Andre Guillen said, that top academics are leaving the country in despair because the government are negotiating on Horizon Europe? When will the government do something now?
Minister. Well, the Honourable Lady is right at the importance of this issue, and the United Kingdom absolutely wishes to move forward, and we would hope the EU would move forward at pace with us to reach an agreement.
Mike Kingsbury.
Question number 9, Mr. Speaker.
Minister.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The loan charge was announced at Budget 2016 as part of a package of measures to tackle disguised remuneration tax avoidance. At Spring Statement 2022, this package was estimated to bring in an overall exchequer yield of £3.4 billion. The changes resulting from the 2019 independent review of the loan charge have reduced the exchequer yield by an estimated £620 million.
Mike Kingsbury.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Too many everyday people are facing huge bills, untold distress, and in some cases personal harm and indeed suicide because of a loan charge scandal. Can the Minister now commit, can the government commit to finally commission a truly independent review to deal with this mess?
Minister.
Well, I think all members of this House who have met constituents who have been affected by the loan charge cannot fail to have been moved by the emotional and psychological impact that has had on many of them. And as Minister, it is right, therefore, that I should look at this issue carefully, and I can say to the member that I will engage with all interested parties on this matter.
Dan Jarvis.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Number 12.
Minister.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and it's a pleasure to answer my first question at the dispatch box from the member from Barnsley Central who replied to my maiden speech. With permission, Mr. Speaker, I should like to answer this question alongside number 17. The Levelling Up White Paper set out a clear plan to level up every corner of the UK by 2030. We're also driving growth and unlocking housing across the UK with our new investment zones. And we're continuing to invest billions in regional infrastructure, including £1.7 billion allocated under the Levelling Up Fund, of which £500 million went to the north.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. It's a pleasure to see the Minister at the dispatch box, and I congratulate her on her appointment. Previous Chancellors have not delivered the level of transformative resource required to level up. Now, I know that the Chancellor does understand the huge potential that exists right across the north of England, but for many of us, the levelling up agenda is sipping in the last chance saloon. Yes. So, can the Minister say what's going to be done differently under this new Chancellor?
We're absolutely committed to the levelling up agenda, and if we look at South Yorkshire received £570 million through the Regional Cities Transport Scheme, £95 million through the Levelling Up Fund and £46 million through the Shared Prosperity Fund. Our ambitions with levelling up continue.
Judith Cummins.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Minister, building on the back of Bradford's City of Culture win and in this momentous year for Rugby League, I am supporting the plan for the transformation and regeneration of the home of the Bradford Bulls, the iconic Odsall Stadium, to become a world-class sports, music and culture arena. This plan would be an incubator for the ambitions of the entire Bradford district, delivering over £1 billion worth of socio-economic benefits. However, following the Bank of England's repeated interventions, can the Minister confirm the Levelling Up Fund Round 2 will still be going ahead in full, and will the Minister and the Chancellor demonstrate this by meeting with me, Bradford Council and the Bradford Bulls and the RFL to discuss our catalyst for growth?
Well, I can absolutely confirm that we will be going ahead with the second round of the Levelling Up Fund, and there should be decisions by the end of the year. I wish her well in her bid. Clearly, there is an independent assessment going on of the bids at the moment, but if it is possible to meet them, we will do that. But clearly, we need to decide if that is appropriate. And I would also like to congratulate her on her success in the first round of the Levelling Up bid, where she got 20 million for Squire Lane Leisure Centre.
Martin Vickers.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The renewable energy sector is vital to my Cleethorpes constituency and the neighbouring area, and has done a great deal to level up the local economy. Can the Minister give an assurance that the support for the sector will continue?
We are very much so committed to the sector, and I would be delighted to sit down with the honourable gentleman to discuss further.
Mr. Speaker, a key part of levelling up is the creation of investment zones. The Chancellor will be aware of the proposals for a gigafactory at Coventry Airport to support UK automotive manufacturing. Does the Minister agree with me that the joint application by Labour Coventry City Council and Conservative Warwickshire County Council for an investment zone at Coventry Airport should be encouraged?
Minister.
We're encouraging all higher local authorities to look at the investment zones and to apply. I think that they are a great tool for development. So absolutely, I would encourage that application.
Pete Wishart.
Mr. Speaker, never so much chaos has ever been inflicted on so many by so few will be the motto that will reverberate down the eons for this government. But can I ask her, do they actually still believe in this fairy tale of levelling up? Isn't it now just a matter of how far they're going to level us all down?
Minister.
Everything that we are doing is being driven by a growth agenda so that we can level up all the way across the United Kingdom.
David Morris.
Oh, thank you, Mr. Speaker. I'm sorry, I couldn't hear at that moment in time. Mr. Speaker, the Eden Project North is, as far as I'm aware, the only project in the Levelling Up Round 2 that has got planning permission and land allocated. What I would like to know is when the decisions will be made so that we can get this shovel-ready scheme going, because Eden themselves have got £50 million from the table, and we're asking for £50 million as match funding in effect.
Decisions on the second phase of the Levelling Up round will be made by the end of the year, and I wish him very well.
David Linden.
Martin. Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I have regular discussions with my right honourable friend, the Secretary of State for Work and Pensions. If his question relates to the operating budget of DWP, we expect departments to live within their existing CSR 21 allocations.
Yes, well, that was point thank for a bit. Anyway, taking questions in the House of Commons, I think we can all agree we're all glad that's over. OK, people, let's liven things up a little bit. I've got loads coming up. Record numbers of migrants crossing the Channel. The traditional English breakfast isn't actually English, apparently. And everyone is working from the pub to save on energy bills. But talking a bit of money, we will bring you more reaction from those questions Kwasi Kwartenga's just faced in the House of Commons on his budget. He's once again under a bit of pressure, isn't he? Because apparently there's a £60 billion black hole in our nation's finances. But apparently Britain needs to find that 60 billion quid to balance the books. The Institute for Fiscal Studies is warning the Chancellor will need to make a big and painful spending cut on various different things. And I mean, one option might be to, I don't know, go for growth. But of course, that seems to be dead in the water. So how do we actually save money? And this is where we try to liven up all of those spending issues. Do we slash foreign aid? Do we slash our defence budget? Do we cut NHS funding? Do we cut benefits? Do we tax the rich? GB Views at gbnews.uk. But I actually went out and asked members of the public how they thought Britain could find an extra £60 billion. Spoiler alert, everybody, nobody was brave enough to say on camera that we need to sort out what's going on in the Channel, stop foreign aid or privatise the NHS.
I have increased taxes for the people that are earning huge amounts of money.
Tax the rich?
Yes.
OK, you wouldn't cut public services?
No.
No?
Of course you wouldn't.
I would not start with social services.
You wouldn't cut public spending?
No. I'd look carefully at the defence budget.
OK.
Perhaps a bit at public works. But I would not, given the likely the certain rise in energy prices, I would not take it from the middle class, taxpayers.
Yeah, I don't think the answer's out there. I think they need to look at the tax to raise the revenue.
So you go tax, potentially?
Absolutely.
You wouldn't cut public spending?
Not with the state that it's in at the moment.
No.
Certainly wouldn't get my vote.
Any other little areas? Foreign aid, defence?
I think it would be very stupid to cut those areas.
I think we're going to do it anyway, because I don't think the fuel cap is going to be applied, is it? Gas prices are dropping, so I think you'll find that the 60 billion will be saved.
Okay.
Yeah.
So for you, as far as you're concerned, nothing to worry about?
Absolutely nothing at all.
All right, you lovely lot. Let's solve Britain's financial crisis live on air. MPs are still in the House of Commons discussing Kwasi Kwarteng's not-so-mini budget. And this afternoon, the Downing Street people have said that the Prime Minister Liz Truss still rejects austerity, despite the warning that the government will need to find more than £60 billion worth of spending cuts to reduce public debt without cancelling their proposed tax cuts. A little bit misleading potentially though, and we're going to get stuck into this because the Institute for Fiscal Studies says that Kwasi Kwarteng will have to find big and painful cuts to public services to get the public finances back under control. The Chancellor is due to set out his medium-term fiscal plan, explaining how the government will get debt falling as a proportion of national income in the wake of his £43 billion mini-budget tax giveaway on October the 31st. Now, you've just heard how the great British public believe that we could find that £60 billion shortfall. The overwhelming majority suggested taxing the rich. How do you feel about that? But what about cutting benefits, spending on the NHS, or the hundreds of millions spent on foreign aid and what's going on in the Channel? Let's start a bit by looking at cutting benefits. And joining me now is independent economist Julian Jessup and welfare and benefits advisor Gary Vogt. I'll start with you, Julian, if that's all right. Is it unpalatable but the right thing to do to cut benefits at this moment in time?
Well, actually, I'd just like to step back a bit and say I sort of reject the premise of the question. I don't believe that there is going to be a 62 billion black hole in the public finances. In order to get those numbers, the IFS has made some quite pessimistic assumptions about economic growth. It's assumed that the government basically tries to hit old fiscal targets rather than new ones. And it assumes that the government doesn't take any advantage of the wriggle room that's already built into the forecast.
Yeah, Julian, can I just say quickly, sorry, just quickly, Julian, I'm going to stick with you just for a second, actually, on this, because I think that's a really, really important point. All of the biggest headlines today are 60 billion quid black hole, 60 billion pounds, But actually, if we went for growth properly, then we wouldn't necessarily have a 60 billion quid black hole. Can you just make that point for us, please, and why that is?
Well, actually, the IFS makes that point. If you wade through their document today and get as far as page 32, they do present an alternative scenario where growth